Picture, for a moment, a small harbour town wrapped in cold December fog in the last winter of the year 1793. The sea is the colour of pewter, flat and slow, and the fog lies upon it so thickly that the masts of the warships out in the roadstead seem to hang unsupported in the grey air, as if the vessels themselves had been rubbed away and only their rigging left behind. There is a smell of salt and wet stone and burnt powder. Somewhere out across the water a gun speaks once, and its sound rolls back off the hills long after the flash has faded, so that the noise and the light have come loose from one another. On a muddy rise above the harbour, among a battery of cannon slick with dew, there stands a slight young officer of artillery. He is thin and rather pale, and not much to look at. His coat is worn, his boots are cheap, and when he gives an order the men around him hear an odd accent in his French, the accent of an island far to the south, an accent that has been mocked in schoolyards and barracks for half his life. He is a nobody. He is a foreign boy with a strange name that no one can spell, 24 years old, with empty pockets and a head full of books, and he is standing in the fog beside the guns, looking out at the hill that commands the harbour, seeing something there that the older and grander men have somehow failed to see. In a little while he will give the order that begins everything, but we are not going to let him give it yet. We are going to leave him there, standing quiet in the December fog, with his hand resting on the cold iron of a cannon, and we are going to come back to him, at that very harbour, a little way into our night. Hold the picture gently in your mind, and then let it go soft at the edges, and let the fog close over it, because before we can understand how a poor island boy came to be standing among those guns, we must go a very long way back, and go slowly, and take the whole night to do it. So, settle in. Wherever you are, whatever kind of day has just let go of you at last, let this be the hour when you put it down. Let the lamp grow dim. Let the room grow soft and warm around you. Let the day slip from your shoulders the way a heavy coat slips from a chair, quietly, in its own time, with no fuss and no hurry. There is nothing more that you need to do tonight. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing left to solve. You are allowed, now, simply to lie still and listen, and to let a very old story carry you, the way a slow river carries a leaf, without effort, without direction, down and down towards sleep. If you enjoy these long, slow journeys through the lives of people long gone, and only if you truly enjoy what I do here, you might like to leave a little sign of it, a like, or that quiet subscribe, so that the lamp stays lit for the next traveller who cannot sleep. And if you feel like it, before your eyes grow too heavy, leave your location and your local time down in the comments, so that we can all imagine, for a moment, the great scattered map of us, all these darkened rooms in all these different places, some just after supper, some deep in the smallest hours before dawn, all of us listening to the same soft voice, all of us drifting down into the same forgiving dark. And now let us go back. Let us go back well before the harbour, well before the fog, well before there is any young officer at all to stand beside the guns, back before the man exists, to the place that made him, because every life begins not with a birth, but with a piece of ground. And this piece of ground is an island. It is called Corsica, and it sits in the warm middle sea between the coast of Italy and the coast of France, a rough green mountain rising straight out of the blue water, all steep grey stone and dark forest, and the endless low silver green of the scented scrub that the islanders call the maki, a scrub so thick with wild herbs that they say you can smell the island out at sea before ever you can see it. It is a proud island, and a poor one, and a stubborn one. For century upon century it has been fought over and traded away and fought over again, held for a long while by the merchant city of Genoa, across the water, never quite tamed, never quite content, a place of narrow loyalties and long memories, and old family quarrels carried down through the generations like heirlooms. The people of the mountains keep to their own, they keep their word, and they keep their grudges, and they have a way of looking at anyone from over the sea as, at best, a guest, and at worst a landlord. And in the years just before our story truly begins, this stubborn island had done a remarkable thing. It had tried, briefly and bravely, to belong to no one but itself. Under a lawyer and soldier named Pasquale Paoli, a man the islanders loved almost as a father, Corsica had thrown off the tired grip of Genoa and set itself up as its own small nation, with its own constitution and its own university and its own quiet dignity. A little republic of shepherds and stone towns holding out in the middle of the sea. It was a fine dream, and like a good many fine dreams, it did not last. For Genoa, weary of holding an island it could no longer control, simply sold the whole troublesome place, sold it outright to the Kingdom of France, and France, being large and near and hungry, sent its armies to collect what it had bought. And so in the year 1768, only the year before our man was born, French soldiers came ashore in their thousands, and the following year, at a river crossing called Ponte Novu, the little island army was broken, and Paoli's brave small republic was finished, and the hero himself slipped away into exile across the water. The dream of a free Corsica went out like a candle in a drought. And that, precisely that, is the world into which our child is born. Not into a free island, and not quite into an old and settled France either, but into the raw new joint between the two, into a proud place that has just lost itself, among a people still stunned and sore at having been sold like a parcel of land and handed to strangers. He is born, you might say, already caught between two countries, already an outsider twice over, a Corsican to the French and, before long, half a Frenchman to the Corsicans. Keep that in the back of your drowsy mind, for it will shape everything that follows. The whole enormous story turns, in a sense, on the fact that its hero began his life belonging nowhere in particular. He is born on the 15th of August, in the year 1769, in the island's chief town of Ajaccio, a small sun-baked port of pale houses and dark shutters climbing up from a curved bay. The family christen him, in the soft Italian spelling still used on the island, Napoleon di Bonaparte. Only much later, as a grown man making his way in France, will he file the name down and smooth it into the shape the whole world would come to know, Napoleon Bonaparte. But that is far ahead. For now he is only a squalling second son in a large and proud and not quite wealthy household. His father is Carlo Buonaparte, called simply Carlo, a handsome, charming, restless minor nobleman and lawyer, a man with fine manners and thin funds, forever hopeful of some advantageous connection, forever a little in debt, forever away on some errand of ambition, a father easy to admire from a distance and hard to lean upon up close. His mother is a very different sort of person altogether. Letizia Ramolino she was born, and Letizia she remained in spirit all her long life, strong-willed, strict, deeply practical, frugal to the bone, married as a girl of 14 and hardened by hardship into something like granite with a candle behind it. She bore many children and buried several, and she ran her uncertain household on an iron economy and a short temper and an unbreakable will, and she trusted very little in life except vigilance and thrift. In later years, when her own son had become the master of half the earth and was showering the family with palaces and crowns, she is remembered for watching it all with a wary, unimpressed eye and murmuring in effect that it was all very well, if only it should last. If only it lasts. It is, when you think about it, the least romantic sentence ever spoken by the mother of an emperor, and possibly the wisest, and if you find yourself half asleep already, and remembering nothing else of this whole night, you could do a great deal worse than to keep that one small, dry. Careful phrase, if only it lasts. Napoleon was the second of the surviving children, born after his older brother Joseph, and before a whole long parade of younger ones, Lucien and Elisa and Louis and Pauline and Caroline and Jerome, a great noisy staircase of siblings whom, years hence, he would deal out across the thrones of Europe like a man dealing cards to his relatives at a family table, making this one a king of Naples and that one a king of Holland and another a king of Westphalia, as casually almost as other men find their brothers a decent job. But all of that lies in a future none of them can imagine. For the moment they are simply children on a hot, poor island, and our particular child, by every account, is a difficult one. Fierce, watchful, quarrelsome. Quick to take offence and slow to forgive it. A boy who fought with his gentler older brother and generally won, who liked to be first and hated to be crossed, and who carried even then a strange concentrated intensity, as if some engine inside him were already running faster and hotter than the engines of the children around him. He was not charming. He was not soft. He was the sort of small, serious, glowering boy that adults find faintly unsettling and other children learn to leave alone. And then, when he was 9 years old, that whole warm, loud, sunlit island world was taken away from him in a single stroke, and he was sent to France. His father, ever working his connections, had secured for his clever, difficult second son a scholarship, a place at a military school on the mainland, in the cold, flat heart of a country the boy had never seen, and whose language he could barely speak. And so a 9-year-old was put aboard a ship and carried away from the smell of the Maquis and the blue curve of the Bay of Ajaccio, away from his mother and the crowd of his brothers and sisters, and set down, alone, homesick, and out of place, at a bleak provincial school in a town called Brienne-le-Château, among the grey fields of eastern France. Try, if you will, to feel the size of that for a small boy, the sudden silence where a whole family had been, the strange food, the strange cold, the tall unfamiliar sky, and all around him the sons of the French nobility, richer than he, at ease in a way he could never quite manage, speaking a rapid French in which his own thick island accent stood out like a stone in a shoe. They mocked him for that accent. They mocked him for his foreign name which they twisted and mispronounced. They mocked him for his poverty, for the plainness of his single set of clothes, for the fact that he had no money and no fine relations to send him treats. And the boy, being the boy he was, did not weep and beg to fit in. He drew a hard shell around himself, and went cold and solitary and proud, and turned, as lonely clever children so often do, to the one company that never mocks and never excludes, the company of books. There is a story, told of him from those Brienne years, that in the deep cold of one hard winter, when snow lay thick across the school grounds, the solitary boy organised the other cadets into armies and built great walls and forts and ramparts of packed snow, and directed the mock battles between them with such seriousness and such uncanny sense of ground that even the boys who despised him fell in gladly under his command. And whether the tale is quite true, or has grown a little in the telling, as the best stories about famous men always do, it has the right shape, for it is the shape of a child who could not join the game and so, instead, quietly took command of it. He spent whole years in that grey school, a stranger to warmth, keeping his island in his heart like a smooth stone in a pocket, writing stiff dutiful letters home, marking off the seasons, growing thin and watchful and older than his age. And all the while he read. He was not, in the ordinary way of school, a brilliant pupil. His French spelling remained frankly terrible to the end of his days, an emperor who never did quite make his peace with the silent letters, and one likes to think of that, of the man who would dictate the laws of a continent, still privately at war with the spelling of his adopted tongue. His Latin was weak, and his manners were worse. But in two things he shone, and they were the two things that would matter. One was mathematics, the cool, clean, certain world of numbers and angles and distances, where an island accent counts for nothing and only the right answer counts. A world in which the awkward outsider could be, quietly, the best in the room. And the other was history. He devoured it. He read and reread the lives of the great captains and conquerors of the ancient world. The Greeks and the Romans. Above all in the old pages of Plutarch, that endless gallery of soldiers and statesmen and their rises and their falls. And here we may allow ourselves the first small dry observation of the night, which is that a poor, proud, friendless boy who spends his childhood reading nothing but the biographies of men who conquered the known world is perhaps not being prepared for a quiet life. He read of Alexander, who wept because there were no more worlds to conquer, He read of Caesar. He filled the loneliness with giants, and measured himself against them in the dark, and it does not seem to have occurred to him, then or ever, that he might not be one of their number. From Brienne, in due course, the promising if prickly young cadet was sent on to the great military academy in Paris itself, the École Militaire, the finishing school of the French officer corps, where the sons of far grander families than his learned to ride and to fence and to command. Here too he was the poor outsider, and here too he kept his own counsel, worked hard, spent little, and finished his course with unusual speed, as a young man in a hurry generally does. Paris itself must have seemed, to the boy from the little bay of Ajaccio, an ocean of stone, the largest and grandest and most bewildering thing he had ever seen, all palaces and churches and endless crowds, and a river running through the middle of it beneath its many bridges. And one imagines him walking those wide new avenues in his plain cadet's coat, with his hands behind his back, a small, serious provincial, taking the measure of the capital he would one day own, though of course he did not know that then, and neither did the city, which took no notice of him at all. It was here, in the branch of the army that suited his cold mathematical mind exactly, that he found his trade, not the glittering cavalry which cost a fortune in horses and belonged to the rich, but the artillery, the science of guns, of trajectories and ranges, and the careful murderous geometry of where a cannonball will fall. Artillery was the thinking man's arm, the branch where a clever poor officer with a head for numbers could make his way on merit rather than on money, and it fitted him as if it had been made for him. In the year 1785, at the age of 16, he was commissioned a second lieutenant of artillery, a real officer at last, with a uniform and a sword and a modest pay, and posted to a garrison in provincial France. That same sad year, far away on the island, his father Carlo died, worn out young by a cancer of the stomach, the very same illness that would one day, decades on and half a world away, quietly close our story too. And the death left the large proud family poorer and more precarious than ever, and laid upon the shoulders of the serious 16-year-old lieutenant, more than upon his easy-going elder brother, a good part of the weight of holding it all together. And so we come to the picture of the young man in the years before the storm, and it is not, on the face of it, the picture of a coming conqueror at all. He is a thin, sallow, intense junior officer in an unfashionable branch of a peacetime army, chronically short of money, sending what little he can spare home to his mother, living in cheap lodgings in dull garrison towns, going without to buy books, reading enormously and furiously across history and geography and government and the fashionable new ideas of the age, filling notebook after notebook with cramped opinions on everything under the sun. He is homesick still, and dreams for years of the island. He thinks of himself as a Corsican patriot far more than as a Frenchman, and nurses schemes of one day going home to free and lead his people. In the long empty evenings of garrison duty, while other young officers gambled and drank and courted the daughters of the town, he sat alone with a candle and a pile of borrowed books and wrote, essays on happiness and on the love of country, notes on the histories of nations, a whole projected history of his beloved Corsica that he never quite finished. A young man's opinions on everything from the ancient Persians to the government of England, all set down in that cramped, misspelt, furiously energetic hand. He took long solitary walks. He ate sparingly and dressed plainly, and saved every coin he could, and even so was forever a little short, forever the poor relation, sending money home to Letitia and the younger children rather than spending it on himself. He was, in short, exactly the kind of intense, self-improving, humourless young man whom one would cross a room to avoid at a party, and it is one of the gentle jokes of history that this austere, bookish, penny-counting outsider, who could not dance and would not gossip and had no small talk at all, was quietly assembling, in those dull provincial rooms, the mind that would one day rearrange the whole of Europe. He is awkward in company, poor at small talk, hopeless with the easy graces of the drawing-room, and generally regarded, when he is regarded at all, as an odd, prickly, bookish little provincial with too many opinions and too few prospects. There is no sign in the sky. There is nothing to mark him out for greatness, except the strange hot engine turning inside, and the vast library of conquerors stored up behind his eyes, and a patience, and a hunger, and a waiting. He is a loaded weapon in a locked room, and the room is quiet, and no one is paying attention. And then the room caught fire. In the year 1789, while our young lieutenant was still an obscure officer dreaming of Corsica, the whole of France cracked open. The old kingdom, sunk in debt and grievance and hunger, came apart at the seams. In the summer of that year the people of Paris rose and stormed the old fortress prison of the Bastille. And what began as a demand for reform swelled and deepened and darkened into the vast, roaring, unstoppable thing we call the Revolution. A storm that would sweep away the king and the nobles and the old order altogether and set the whole of Europe trembling. And a revolution, whatever else it is a furnace for young men. It tears down the old ceilings that once held ambitious, low-born, talented men firmly in their place. It kills off or drives out the comfortable senior officers of the old army and leaves the ranks above suddenly, giddily empty, it declares, in its ringing new language, that careers shall be open to talent, that a man shall rise by what he can do and not by whose son he is. For a poor, gifted, hungry provincial lieutenant with no money and no name and an enormous opinion of his own destiny, the revolution was not a catastrophe. It was a door, flung suddenly wide. But the young man's first thought was not of France at all. It was, as it had always been, of home. In the confusion of those early revolutionary years he went back again and again to Corsica, throwing himself into the tangled, feverish, small-scale politics of the island, where the great questions of Paris played out in miniature among a few thousand quarrelling families. The old hero Paoli had returned from exile to a hero's welcome, and for a time the young Bonaparte hoped to serve under him, to be Corsica's soldier, to braid his own rising ambition together with the cause of his island. But it did not work. Paoli, the grand old man, seems to have distrusted the intense, calculating young officer and his equally ambitious clan, and the young officer, for his part, grew ever more committed to the French Revolution and its sweeping new order, while Paoli drifted the other way, toward the island's old ways and, in the end, toward the protection of revolutionary France's great enemy across the water. Britain, the two ambitions could not share an island. And there is something quietly fitting, something almost gently sad, in the fact that the young man's very first great political passion, the cause he loved before he loved anything else in the world, ended not in triumph but in a falling out. That the boy who had dreamed for 20 years of freeing his homeland found himself, in the end, quarrelling bitterly with the very hero of that homeland, the ageing Paoli whom he had once all but worshipped. It is the first of many partings in this long story, and by no means the last time that a great man of his age will begin as our hero's idol and end as his enemy. The break, when it came, was total and bitter. The Bonaparte family, having chosen France and the Revolution over Paoli and the old Corsica, found themselves on the losing side of their own island's quarrel, marked men, their house no longer safe, their name no longer welcome. And so, in the year 1793, the whole family, the widowed mother Laetitia and the long staircase of children, were driven out of Corsica altogether, forced to abandon the sun-baked town and the blue bay and the scented hills, and to flee across the water as refugees to the mainland of France, arriving with very little beyond their pride and their name and each other. Think of that quiet reversal, and let it settle softly over you as we close this first part of the night. The boy who had been sent away weeping to a cold foreign land, and who for 20 years had dreamed only of going home to his island and belonging to it, had now lost the island for good, had been cast out by the very homeland he loved, and stood, at last, with nothing left to be but a Frenchman. All the doors homeward were shut behind him. Only the great burning open door of revolutionary France lay ahead. and France in that year had need of soldiers, for the young republic was now at war with half the kings of Europe at once, its borders aflame, its ports threatened, its enemies closing in from every side, and everywhere along its coasts and frontiers there were guns to be served and battles to be fought and desperate. Wide open, blood-soaked ladder of opportunity for any young officer of artillery who knew his trade and was not afraid to climb. So here we leave him, for now. A penniless young Corsican with a smoothed-down French name, 24 years old, his island lost, his father dead, his family scattered and dependent upon him, his head still full of Plutarch and ancient conquerors, standing at last on the mainland of the country he would one day rule, looking about him with those strange, steady eyes for a war in which to make himself useful. And down along the southern coast, at a great naval harbour where the British fleet had lately slipped in among the enemies of France, the December fog was already gathering over the grey water. The fog we began with. The fog where a slight unknown officer would soon stand beside the guns and see what no one else could see. But that harbour, and that fog, and that first great turning of his fortune must wait now until we meet again. For tonight, let it be enough that the boy has become the young man, that the island is behind him, and that the long road out into the world lies open and quiet before him in the dark. Rest here a while. There is a great deal of story still to come, and all the time in the world in which to tell it. And so we come back, as promised, to the harbour in the fog. It is December of 1793, and the port of Toulon lies wrapped in a cold sea mist that will not lift, the kind of grey winter weather that softens every hard edge and turns ships into shadows and men into rumours of men. Out in the roadstead ride the great wooden warships of the British fleet, and beside them the ships of their Spanish and Neapolitan friends, at anchor in a harbour that ought by rights to belong to France and does not, because the town has opened its gates to the enemy and handed its fleet and its walls to strangers rather than to the young republic in Paris. The revolution has come to a place that did not want it, and the price of that refusal is a foreign fleet sitting fat and comfortable in a French harbour, and around the hills a ragged Republican army trying to take back what has been given away. It is not going well. It has not been going well for weeks. The generals are quarrelling, the guns are in the wrong places, the assaults have failed, and the whole tired business has the feel of a thing that will grind on all winter and come to nothing. And among the men who have drifted into this stalled and unhappy siege, sent almost by accident to command its artillery after the previous officer was wounded, is a slight young captain with a Corsican accent and a hungry, restless mind, the same lonely, bookish, penniless young man we followed through the schoolrooms of Brienne and the cheap lodgings of Paris, and he is looking at the fog, and at the ships, and at the hills, and he is seeing something that the older and grander men around him have somehow failed to see. What he sees is very simple, and that is exactly why it is brilliant. He sees that the town is not the point. The town is only a prize. The real key to Toulon is not its walls but its water, the inner harbour where the enemy fleet lies, because a fleet that cannot stay cannot hold the town, and a fleet can be driven out not by storming the streets, but by taking one particular promontory of high ground that looks straight down upon the anchorage. Plant guns on that height, he reasons, and you do not need to fight your way through the town at all. You simply make the harbour untenable, you make the water too hot to float on, and the great ships must either burn where they lie or slip their cables and run for the open sea, and the town, left naked, must fall of its own accord. It is the kind of insight that seems obvious the moment it is spoken and invisible until then, and it is the first time the world catches a clear glimpse of the particular gift that will carry this young man so improbably far. A gift not for courage exactly, though he has plenty, and not for grand speeches, of which he makes few, but for looking at a confused and cluttered situation and seeing through it to the single point on which everything actually turns. He argues for his hill. He argues for it patiently and then insistently, and then relentlessly, wearing down the doubters, gathering cannon from wherever he can beg or scavenge them, dragging up powder and shot along muddy winter roads, drilling his gunners, building his batteries in the cold and the wet with a thoroughness that his easygoing superiors find faintly exhausting to watch. He names one of his batteries, with the dry theatrical flair that will follow him all his life, the battery of the men without fear, on the sensible theory that men will more happily man a gun that flatters them. And in the middle of December, when at last the assault goes in against the fortified height, he is there in the thick of it, on foot in the freezing dark, and he takes a bayonet wound in the thigh, and the position is stormed, and the guns are hauled up onto the high ground exactly as he said they should be, and they open their mouths and begin to speak down onto the crowded harbour below. And it happens just as the young man promised it would. The enemy fleet, suddenly finding itself under a rain of iron it cannot answer and cannot escape, does the only sensible thing and leaves, cutting cables, setting sail, some of the ships burning as they go, the whole proud armada that had sat so comfortably in the mist now streaming out to sea in an undignified hurry, and behind them the town of Toulon, its protectors fled, falls back into Republican hands within a day. And there in the smoke, muddy and limping and not yet 25 years old, stands the man who saw the hill. His reward comes swiftly, because the Republic in that hungry season is desperate for anyone who can actually win, and it does not much care where he comes from or how he talks. In a matter of days, the slight Corsican captain, the poor boy mocked for his accent, the outsider who had spent his lonely youth reading about the campaigns of the ancient dead, is made a general of brigade, a general at 24, leaping over the heads of older and better connected men, and the boy from the fog, as we said we would find him, is a general at last. It is worth pausing on the sheer unlikeliness of it. In the calm way one pauses over a strange and pleasing fact before sleep. A little over a decade before, he had been a homesick child weeping into his straw mattress at a school where the other boys laughed at his island name. Now he wore a general's braid because he had understood a harbour better than anyone else alive. The world had not become kinder. It had simply, for one winter, needed exactly the thing that he happened to be. And it is worth noticing, in the calm way one notices such things at the edge of sleep, how much of what would later look like destiny was really only this: a young man who had prepared himself for something without knowing what, filling the long empty years with study the way another might fill them with idleness, so that when the one narrow door opened at last he was, almost alone among all the men of his time, entirely ready to walk through it. The reading he had done in the cold dormitories, the mathematics, the endless problems of angle and range, and the flight of a heavy ball through the air, all of it turned out to have been, without his ever planning it so, the exact and particular knowledge that a besieged harbour would one December require. He had studied the guns because the guns were what a poor boy without connections was allowed to study, and the guns, in the end, had made him. There is a lesson in that, perhaps, though the sleep-teller will not press it too hard at this hour, and it is only this, that a man cannot always choose the door that opens, but he can, in the long grey waiting, make himself into the sort of man who is ready when it does. Let us follow him gently onward, for the years just after Toulon are not a smooth golden road, but a strange, uneven, up-and-down stretch, the sort of interval that biographies tend to hurry past, and that is, for our purposes tonight, all the more soothing for its lack of drama. The revolution in these years is a devouring, unstable thing, and to rise within it is to stand on a floor that keeps tilting. The very faction that had promoted him falls from power, its leaders sent to the guillotine in the great turn of fortune that ends the terror. And because the young general had been friendly with the wrong brother of the wrong fallen leader, he finds himself, for a short and anxious spell, under a cloud, briefly arrested, briefly suspected, his career stalled almost before it has properly begun. He is offered a command he does not want, in a war he thinks pointless, in a corner of the country far from where the real decisions are made, and he declines it, and for his refusal he is struck off the list of active generals altogether, and for a while this future master of Europe is simply an unemployed young man in Paris, with no money, no posting, and no obvious prospects, walking the streets in a shabby coat, half seriously wondering whether he might offer his services to the Sultan of Turkey, since France seemed to have no further use for him. It is one of history's quieter jokes that the man who would remake a continent spent a season of his youth essentially loitering, broke and overlooked, filling his empty hours with mathematics and half-finished schemes and long letters, waiting for something to turn. And then, as these things do, something turns. In the autumn of 1795, the shaky Republican government in Paris finds itself threatened by a rising of its own, a great crowd of royalists and malcontents gathering in the streets, many thousands of armed men marching on the seat of power, far more numerous than the few troops available to defend it, and the men in charge, in their panic, cast about for a soldier ruthless enough and quick enough to save them, and someone remembers the sharp, unsmiling young general with nothing better to do. He takes the job without illusions. He sends a young cavalry officer galloping across the city through the night to seize the cannon from a park on the edge of Paris, and he places those guns himself, at the street corners and the approaches. With the same cold clear eye he had turned on the harbour at Toulon, and when the crowd surges forward he gives the order, and the guns fire into the packed streets, and the rising is broken in an afternoon, in a storm of grape shot that would afterward be remembered, with a certain grim economy of phrase, as a whiff of grape shot, as though it had been a small thing, a breath, a nothing. It was not a small thing to those it struck, but it saved the government. And a rescued government is a grateful government, and once again the young Corsican rises on the strength of having done efficiently the hard thing that no one else would do. Overnight he is somebody again, a commander of the Army of the Interior, a man consulted and courted, a coming figure in the drawing-rooms of a Paris that had ignored him a month before. And it is in exactly this season of sudden reflected glory, this brief giddy interval when the shabby, unemployed officer has become a man worth inviting to dinner, that he meets the woman who will haunt him for the rest of his days. Her name is Josephine. She is a Creole widow from the faraway island of Martinique, some years older than he, with 2 half-grown children and a first husband lost to the guillotine, a woman of soft manners and worn elegance and considerable debts, graceful, worldly, a little weary, entirely his opposite. He falls for her with the sudden, total, faintly comical helplessness of a serious young man who has never before had time for love and now discovers he has no defences against it whatsoever. He, who could see through a battlefield in an instant, cannot see through her at all, and does not want to. He writes her letters of an almost alarming ardour, letters that pour and tumble and repeat themselves, letters that beg her to think of him, that scold her for not writing back quickly enough, that burn on the page with an intensity that must have been, for their cool and much courted recipient, by turns flattering and slightly overwhelming. She is fond of him, in a measured, amused, sensible way. He is on fire, and in the spring of 1796, in a plain civil ceremony, with him fudging his age upward, and her fudging hers downward, so that the gap between them might look a little less startling on the paper, they are married. It is around this same moment, as he steps onto the larger stage, that he quietly files down the Corsican corners of his name, letting the old island spelling soften into the sleeker French form the world would come to know, so that the awkward foreign boy is, even in his signature, becoming someone new. And then, having married the great love of his life, he does the thing that will define the whole strange rhythm of their marriage. He leaves. Almost at once, within days, he goes off to his army, because a very great posting has come to him hand in hand with his very great romance, and the 2 arrivals are not unconnected. He has been given command of the French army in Italy, a command many grander men had eyed, and he goes to take it up trailing love letters behind him all the way, writing to Josephine from every dusty inn on the road south, missing her extravagantly while riding hard toward the first campaign that will make him not merely a useful general, but a legend. What he finds when he reaches his new army would have discouraged a lesser or a saner man. It is an army in the way that a scarecrow is a farmer, an army on paper, and a rabble in fact, unpaid for months. half of it barefoot, its uniforms in rags, its horses starving, its morale somewhere below the frost line, camped in the cold shadow of the Alps and thoroughly convinced that Paris has forgotten it exists. To this ragged, grumbling, half-mutinous body of men there arrives a thin, pale, intense young general whom none of them have heard of, younger than many of the soldiers he now commands. And the older officers under him, seasoned campaigners with real reputations, are inclined at first to regard him as a political appointment, a lucky boy who married well and got a plum, a lightweight to be humoured and managed. They stop thinking that very quickly. What follows in the north of Italy across the next year is the sort of campaign that turns a name into a legend, and it is worth savouring slowly, not as a catalogue of battles, but as the unfolding of a single astonishing quality, which is speed. He moves his ragged army faster than armies were believed able to move. He marches it along roads the enemy is not troubled to guard, appears where he is not expected, throws his whole weight against one part of a larger foe before its other parts can gather, beats it, and is gone again before the bruise has swelled, dividing his enemies, outthinking them, outwalking them, winning battle after battle with an army that by every sober measure ought to have lost. He pays his hungry soldiers partly in victories and partly in the plain promise that beyond the mountains lay warmth and food and plenty, and they follow him because he wins, and because winning is a habit that feeds on itself, and because there is something in the sheer improbable momentum of the thing that makes tired men young. He sends home the fruits of it all, the captured banners and the wagon-loads of treasure and the paintings stripped from Italian palaces, and he sends home, too, his own name, wrapped in the reports and the rumours and the printed bulletins that he writes with a novelist's care, so that a France weary of grey struggle suddenly has a bright young hero to talk about, a general who does not lose. A story unfolding in the sunshine of the south. By the time he has finished with Italy, he has beaten army after army, remade the map of half a peninsula, dictated terms to old and famous powers as though he and not the government in Paris were the true master of French policy, and made himself, at not yet 30, the most famous soldier in Europe. And through all of it the letters keep flowing home to Josephine, tender and jealous and imploring, for the strange truth of that whole triumphant year is that the conqueror of Italy spent a great deal of it lovesick, fretting between battles over whether his wife in Paris thought of him as often as he thought of her, which, it must gently be said, she almost certainly did not. She came out to join him for a while amid the marble and the glory, brought reluctantly and late. And the reunion was not quite the meeting of the letters, for he loved a woman he had half invented on paper, and she was, sensibly, only herself. It is one of the quiet ironies that thread through his whole life, that the man who could read a battlefield at a glance and bend nations to his plans was, in this one soft corner of himself, forever guessing, forever reaching, forever a little unsure of the one heart he most wanted, and there is something almost restful in the thought that even he, even the great engine of ambition, carried about with him this ordinary, aching, unmanageable human tenderness that no victory could ever quite satisfy, and still in the wider matter of the world he is not satisfied, because satisfaction is the one faculty that seems to have been left out of him at birth. With Italy won and a fragile peace signed, his restless eye turns of all directions east, toward the ancient world, toward Egypt, toward a scheme so grand and so strange that it belongs half to strategy and half to a boy's dream of following in the footsteps of the conquerors he had read about by candlelight. The plan, soberly stated, is to strike at British power by seizing Egypt and threatening the long road to India to plant a French foothold in the Eastern Sea. But that is only the daylight half of it. The other half is romance, pure and simple, the pull of the pyramids and the Sphinx and the deep old silence of a land of pharaohs upon a man raised on the lives of Alexander and Caesar. And so in the summer of 1798 he sails, and this is where the expedition becomes truly unlike any war before it, because he fills his ships not only with soldiers and horses and guns, but with scholars, more than 150 of them, mathematicians and astronomers and chemists and artists and antiquaries, a whole floating academy of the curious, brought along to measure and sketch and study a country the French barely knew, so that the invasion carried in its baggage the peaceful ambition to understand the very land it came to seize. The army slips across the sea, evading the watching British ships almost by luck, and lands in the shimmering heat, and marches inland through a strange bright dust toward the old capital, and beneath the great stone pyramids, in the flat glare of the African afternoon, it fights and wins the battle that would be remembered by the name of those tombs, scattering a brave and antique army of horsemen with the cold new arithmetic of massed muskets and disciplined squares. For a moment, it looks like another chapter of the same golden story. The young conqueror beneath the monuments of the deep past, his savants already fanning out to measure and marvel, one of them soon to stumble upon a broken slab of dark stone carved in 3 scripts that would one day unlock the whole lost language of the pharaohs, a quiet treasure worth more in the end than any battle. For it is a strange and rather lovely fact that the most lasting thing to come out of the whole doomed Egyptian adventure was not a conquest at all, but a piece of learning. That the soldiers went home in defeat and the scholars went home with the beginnings of a whole new science of the ancient world, so that the expedition which failed as a war succeeded, almost by accident, as an act of curiosity, and the pyramids gave up more to the men with measuring rods than to the men with muskets. The heat of that country lay over everything like a weight, a dry white blaze that wearied the northern soldiers and killed them quietly with fever and thirst far more than the enemy ever did. And there is a melancholy in imagining those tired European men, so very far from their cool green homelands, camped among monuments older than anything they had ever known, chasing a dream of empire across sand that did not care whether they lived or died. But the sea, which he had crossed on luck, now turns against him. Out in the bay where his fleet lies at anchor, the British Admiral Nelson, who had been hunting him across the whole width of the Mediterranean, at last finds the French ships, and in one furious evening and night of close and terrible fighting he destroys them almost utterly, burning and sinking the fleet at its moorings, so that when the smoke clears the French army in Egypt is discovered to be an army marooned, cut off from home by a sea it no longer controls, a conqueror stranded in his conquest with no road back. And here the young general does a thing that is at once cold and clear-eyed and not entirely admirable, a thing that shows the other, harder edge of the same decisiveness we have been admiring all along. He grasps, sooner than his stranded soldiers do, that the Egyptian dream is over, that nothing more of glory or profit is to be won under that pitiless sun, and that his real future lies not in the desert, but in Paris, where the ground is shifting and a bold man might seize far more than a province. And so, quietly, telling almost no one, he arranges a fast ship, and he slips away across the sea by night, leaving his army behind him in the sand under another man's command, sailing home to France while the men he had led to the pyramids are left to their long doomed holding on. It is not the conduct of a storybook hero, and the sleep-teller will not pretend otherwise, but it is entirely the conduct of a man who has understood, as he always understands, exactly where the true lever of his fortune now lies. He comes home to a France grown tired of its own government, the squabbling committee of lawyers and speculators called the Directory, which nobody loves and nobody quite trusts, a regime that had kept the Republic alive through danger, but had never won the affection of the people it governed, corrupt and shaky and weary and waiting, almost visibly, to be pushed over by anyone with the nerve to do it. It had inherited a republic exhausted by a decade of bloodshed and hunger and fear, and it had kept that republic upright, more or less, through wars on every frontier and plots at home, which is no small thing. And yet it had never won a single heart, never given the ordinary tired people of France anything to love or trust, so that it survived not because anyone wanted it, but because no one had yet arranged its removal. It was, in the plain old phrase, a government of the day before yesterday, holding on out of habit, and everyone from the banker to the soldier to the farmer half sensed that some stronger hand was coming, and half wished it would come soon, if only so that the endless nervous uncertainty might stop. And into this tired, waiting France steps the returning hero, the general who does not lose, his Egyptian misfortunes conveniently blurred by distance and by his own careful bulletins, so that what the crowds see arriving is not a man who abandoned an army, but the glittering young conqueror of Italy come home at last. He is courted at once by the plotters already gathering to overthrow the feeble government, men who want a sword to lean their scheme upon and think they have found in him a useful, biddable blade. They will discover their error in time. In the grey November of 1799 comes the carefully laid, and then very nearly botched, business of the coup. 2 long tense days of manoeuvre and persuasion and cold nerve, of soldiers moved into position and frightened politicians talked round, and one very bad afternoon when the whole plot teeters on the edge of collapse. For the great soldier, oddly, is no natural conspirator, and at the decisive moment, hauled before a hostile and shouting chamber of deputies, he loses his composure, stammers, goes pale, says the wrong things, and has to be rescued from his own clumsiness by the quicker wits of his younger brother, and by a file of grenadiers who at last simply clear the hall of its lawmakers at the point of the bayonet. It is not elegant. It is not the smooth seizure of legend. It is a near-run, half-bungled, sweating scramble that succeeds in the end less because it was well done than because no one on the other side wanted the tottering old government badly enough to die for it. But succeed it does, and when the dust settles and the shouting dies and the frightened deputies have gone home. The arrangement that emerges places France, quietly and almost anticlimactically, in the hands of 3 consuls, of whom 1 very plainly matters, and 2 very plainly do not. And that one is the slight Corsican who 6 years before had been an unknown captain limping through the fog at Toulon. He is first consul now, no longer a general serving the state, but the man who holds it in his hands. And the century itself is turning over as he takes his grip, the old 1600s and 1700s of kings and courts giving way to something new and unnamed that the world does not yet have a word for, though it will soon enough learn to call it by his name. And there we may leave him tonight, at the very hinge of his life, the ragged army and the foggy harbour and the marooned desert all behind him now. The whole of France before him, a young man of 30 who set out to win battles and has ended by taking possession of a country. And who is about to discover, as many restless men discover, that winning a nation and governing one are 2 very different labours, the first a matter of a single brilliant afternoon, and the second the long grey work of years. But that is a story for the chapters ahead, and there is no hurry, none at all. For now it is enough to let him stand there at the turn of the century, with the fog long lifted and the whole quiet waiting continent laid out before him, and to let the lamp burn a little lower, and to rest. And so the soldier who had spent his whole young life learning how to win battles now had to learn the far quieter, far duller, far more difficult art of running a country, which is a thing that no cannon has ever accomplished and no cavalry charge has ever settled. It is one thing to take a city in an afternoon, it is another thing entirely to decide, over years, who shall collect the taxes in that city, and how the bakers shall be licensed, and what shall be taught to the children, and whether the road that leads out of the town should be repaired this spring or the spring after. Napoleon, now first consul, discovered in himself an appetite for exactly this kind of work, the endless small grinding work of administration, and he fell upon it the way he had fallen upon everything else in his life, which is to say without rest, and without much mercy for the people around him. He was, in the winter of 1799, and all through the years that followed, a man who worked the way other men eat when they are starving. He rose in the small hours of the morning, and he worked through the day, and he worked through the evening, and then, when honest men were long asleep, he went on working, dictating letters and decrees and questions and corrections to a relay of secretaries who took him in shifts because no single secretary could survive him. He would wear one man out and simply call for the next, the way a tired horse is changed at a coaching inn, and the poor secretaries learned to dread the sound of his voice going on and on into the darkness, because it meant that somewhere in France a law was being remade, and they were the ones who had to write it down. If you have ever had a manager who answered emails at 3 a.m. and seemed faintly disappointed that you did not, then you already understand something important about the government of France in the year 1800, and you may take a small comfort in knowing that the type is very old indeed. He had, it must be said, a mind built for exactly this labour, a mind like a vast and orderly set of drawers, in which every fact he had ever been told was filed away, and could be pulled out again at a moment's notice, the strength of a regiment on some distant frontier, the depth of a harbour he had glanced at years before, the name of a minor official in a town he had passed through once, the quantity of gunpowder in a fortress 1,000 miles away. He forgot nothing that was useful, and he saw quickly, far more quickly than the men around him, to the heart of whatever question was placed before him, and he had, above all, the rare and rather terrifying gift of being able to shift his whole attention from one subject to another and back again, without losing his place in either, so that he might dictate a plan of battle and a schedule of road repairs, and a letter to a wayward brother all in the same restless hour, each one clear, each one complete, each one attended to with the same fierce concentration. It was a gift, and it was also, in a way, a kind of curse, for a man who can do everything himself is very apt to try to do everything himself, and to trust no one else to do it, and to end by carrying upon his own shoulders a weight that no single pair of shoulders was ever meant to bear. Now, the thing that must be understood about these years, these builder years, the quiet years of the consulate, is that they were in many ways the most important years of his whole life, more important than any battle, more lasting than any crown, though they make for far less noise in the telling. For while he was winning his famous victories abroad, and the newspapers were full of them, he was at home doing something that would outlast every single one of those victories. He was rebuilding France from the foundations, patiently, board by board and stone by stone, out of the rubble that 10 years of revolution had left behind. And of all the things he built in those years, the greatest, the one that has lasted longest and travelled furthest and done the most good in the quiet, ordinary lives of ordinary people, was a book. Not a sword, not a throne, but a book of laws. Before Napoleon, the law of France had been a tangle, a thicket, a great overgrown wilderness of old customs and older privileges, where the rules changed as you crossed a river or climbed a hill, where the north of the country was governed by one set of ancient usages and the south by another, where a thing that was legal in one province might be a crime in the next, and where only the lawyers profited, because only the lawyers could find their way through the maze, and they charged handsomely to lead you by the hand. It was, in short, the sort of system that seems designed by no one and defended by everyone, the sort of muddle that every country accumulates over centuries and that almost no country ever finds the will to sweep away. Napoleon swept it away. He gathered the best legal minds of France around a table, and he sat with them himself, night after night, more nights than anyone expected of a general, asking his blunt soldiers questions, cutting through the lawyerly fog, demanding that the thing be made plain, made short, made clear enough that a reasonable man might read it and understand what the law required of him. And out of that came the Civil Code, the Code Napoleon, one clear book that gathered the whole tangle into order, that said the same thing in the north as in the south, that treated, at least on paper, one citizen much as another, that made property secure and contracts binding and the rules of ordinary life knowable in advance. It was not perfect, and it was not gentle to everyone, and later ages would find much in it to quarrel with, particularly in what it said and did not say about women, who were placed very firmly under the authority of husbands and fathers in a manner that would satisfy nobody today. But it was clear, and it was orderly, and it was the same for everyone it covered, and that clarity was a kind of revolution all its own, a quieter revolution than the one with the guillotine, but a deeper one, and a longer-lasting one. Long after the last of his soldiers had died in their beds, long after the eagles and the flags were folded away into museums, The code went on, quietly governing the marriages and the inheritances and the bargains of millions of people who had never fought in any war and never wished to, and it governs many of them still, in France and in a great many other countries besides, which is a strange and rather wonderful sort of immortality for a man chiefly remembered for the noise of his cannon. He himself understood this, in his later years, better than the newspapers ever did. He said, or is said to have said, that his true glory was not the 40 battles he had won, for Waterloo would one day wipe out the memory of all of them, but that nothing could wipe out his civil code, which would live forever. And in that, unlike in a great many things, he was very nearly right. But the code was only the largest of the works of those years, and there were others, and each one was a stone laid in the foundation of the modern French state, and indeed of a great many modern states that copied it afterward. He made his peace with the Church. The Revolution had quarrelled bitterly with the old religion, had seized the lands of the Church and hunted its priests and tried, for a mad season, to replace God himself with a goddess of reason set up in the cathedrals, which is the sort of thing that seems like a marvellous idea at a certain hour of a certain kind of evening, and looks very foolish indeed in the cold light of the following morning. Napoleon, who was not himself a devout man, and who regarded religion rather as a general regards a well-placed reserve of troops, useful chiefly for what it could hold together, saw that a nation cannot go on forever at war with the faith of its own grandmothers. And so he made the Concordat, an agreement with the Pope in Rome, Pius VII, that ended the long quarrel, that let the priests come home and the bells ring again, while keeping the Church firmly, carefully, under the eye of the state. It pleased almost no one entirely, which is often the surest sign that a compromise is a good one, and it gave France back its Sundays. The devout thought he had given the Church too little, and the old revolutionaries thought he had given it far too much, and both of them grumbled, and he let them grumble, for he had learned long since that a ruler who waits to act until everybody is pleased will wait until the end of the world and act never. The important thing, to his soldiers' way of thinking, was that the quarrel was over, that the wound had been closed, that a whole nation could once again baptize its children and bury its dead in the old familiar way without feeling that it was committing a crime against the state, and that is no small thing to have given a people, whatever the theologians may say about the fine print of the bargain. He founded the Bank of France to steady the money and hold the value of things, because he understood, as soldiers who have gone unpaid always understand, that an empire runs not on glory but on coin, and that a treasury is quite as important as an army, and a great deal less exciting to read about. He built roads, straight and hard and good, reaching out across the country, so that men and goods and, it must be admitted, soldiers could move where before they had struggled. And he built schools, the lycees, a whole ladder of them, a system meant to find the clever boys wherever they were born, and lift them up and train them for the service of the state, because he believed, with the fierce certainty of a man who had done exactly this himself, in what he called careers open to talent. It was one of the truest and best of all his ideas, and it was in a sense the story of his own life turned into a policy. The notion that a man ought to rise as high as his gifts could carry him, and no higher and no lower, that the son of a poor lawyer on a rocky island ought to be able to climb, by his own wits and his own labour, all the way to the top of the world, without any door being shut in his face merely because of the name he was born with. It was a magnificent idea. He would spend a fair part of his later life quietly betraying it, handing out titles and thrones to his own relations with a lavishness that would have shamed any king of the old order. But the idea itself outlived his betrayal of it, and it is with us yet, every time a clever child from nowhere in particular is given a chance to become something, and we are all, whether we know it or not, a little in his debt for it, and so stone by stone, book by book, road by road, the consul built. He was made consul for life, which is a curious phrase, a crown in all but name and spelling, a way of being a king while still insisting. With a straight face, that one was nothing of the sort. But a man like that does not stop at a phrase. There was, in the end, only one thing left to reach for, one last title, the oldest and grandest word of all, and he reached for it. On a cold morning in the December of the year 1804, in the great Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, the boy from the foggy harbour was made Emperor of the French. Consider the strangeness of it, quietly, as the lamp burns low. Barely 10 years before, he had been an unknown and unpromising artillery officer with holes in his boots and no prospects worth the name, a foreigner mocked for his accent, a nobody among nobodies. And now the Pope himself, the successor of St. Peter, the head of the Church of Rome, had been brought all the long cold way from Italy across the winter mountains, to stand in a Paris cathedral hung with ermine and gold, and to bless the crowning of this Corsican boy. The great church was freezing that day, for all the candles and all the crowds, for stone cathedrals in December keep the cold the way a cellar keeps it, and the assembled great ones of France shivered in their velvet and their jewels, and waited to see the thing done. And here we come to the moment on which this whole long story turns, the single gesture that says more about the man than 100 battles could, and it is worth dwelling upon, slowly, in the warm and drowsy dark. For by the old custom, by every custom stretching back 1,000 years and more, the crown is placed upon the new sovereign's head by the hands of the Pope, or of the Church. As a sign that earthly power is given from above, granted, bestowed, handed down as a gift that a grateful king receives with bowed head. That is how it had always been done. That is how everyone in the cold cathedral expected it to be done. And Napoleon did not do it that way. At the appointed moment he took the crown into his own hands, and he did not wait, and he did not bow, and he did not let the Pope place it upon him. He lifted it himself, and he set it upon his own head himself, crowning himself with his own 2 hands before the eyes of the Pope and the eyes of all France, saying, without a single word, that he had taken this and received it from no one, that he owed his greatness to nobody above him, that the crown was his because he had made it his, because he had climbed to it, because he had earned it with his own labour and his own genius, and would hold it by the same. And then, still not finished, he took a second crown and set it gently upon the head of Josephine, kneeling before him in her white gown and her diamonds, crowning his empress with his own hands as he had crowned himself, the older Creole widow from the islands who had once seemed so far above the ragged young general, now raised by him to the highest place a woman could hold in the Western world. It was the proudest gesture in a life full of proud gestures, and there was in it something magnificent and something faintly absurd all at once, as there so often is in the very grandest human moments, and the 2 things do not cancel out but sit side by side, the magnificence and the absurdity, the way the sublime and the ridiculous are said to be separated by only a single step, a saying which was, as it happens, one of his own. The Corsican boy from the fog had handed the crown to no one. He had taken it himself, and now, having taken it, he had to defend it, for the kings of Europe, the real kings, the ones born to it, looked upon this self-made upstart emperor with a horror that was almost comical in its sincerity, the horror of an old and exclusive club discovering that a tradesman has let himself in and put his boots up on the good furniture. They could not abide him. He was living proof that their crowns were not sacred after all, that a man might simply seize such things if he were bold enough and clever enough, and that was a lesson they could not allow the world to learn. And so, again and again, they gathered their armies against him, coalition after coalition, king joining with king and emperor with emperor, all of them frightened, all of them determined to put the intruder back in his place, and again, for a glorious handful of years, he beat them. Of all those victories the finest, the one that soldiers would study for 200 years and more, the one he himself loved best, came almost exactly 1 year after the coronation, upon the very first anniversary of the day he had crowned himself. In the cold December of the year 1805, on the rolling frozen fields of Moravia, near a village called Austerlitz. They called it afterward the Battle of the 3 Emperors, because 3 of them were present upon that field, the young Tsar of Russia, and the Emperor of Austria on the one side, and Napoleon on the other, 1 against 2. And it was the 1 against the 2 who won, and won so completely that men would speak of it with wonder for lifetimes. He won it, in the simplest terms, by pretending to be weak. He let the enemy see an army that seemed tired and thin and badly placed, an army that appeared to be making a nervous mistake, offering up its right flank like a fat purse left on a bench. And the enemy, seeing what looked like a gift, could not resist reaching for it. They poured their strength down onto that tempting flank, stretching and thinning their own centre to do it, weakening the very middle of their line, exactly as he had known they would, exactly as he had planned that they would from the start. And when their centre was stretched thin as old cloth, he struck it hard up the middle, through a freezing fog that lifted at the perfect hour into a low winter sun, the famous sun of Austerlitz, and he broke them clean in two, and rolled up the pieces, and drove a good part of a fleeing army out across frozen ponds, where the ice gave way beneath them. It was the masterpiece, the demonstration, the day on which everything he had ever learned about war came together in a single flawless afternoon, and after it the great alliance against him simply fell apart, the beaten emperors suing for peace, the whole edifice of his enemies collapsing like a kicked-over house of cards. And out of the wreckage of that victory came a quiet, almost ghostly consequence, the sort of thing that gets a single line in the history books and yet marks the passing of an entire age of the world. There had existed, for 1,000 years since the time of Charlemagne, a thing called the Holy Roman Empire, a vast, ancient, creaking, half-imaginary institution that sprawled across the middle of Europe, an empire that a famous wit had long ago observed was neither holy nor Roman, nor much of an empire, but which had gone on existing anyway out of sheer venerable habit, the way very old things sometimes do. Napoleon, in the aftermath of Austerlitz, simply wound it up. He rearranged the German lands to suit himself, and the 1,000-year empire, unable to bear the weight of him, was quietly declared to be at an end, its last emperor laying down the ancient title, and a thing that had lasted since the dawn of the Middle Ages passed out of the world with hardly a sound, folded up and put away like an old flag, because one Corsican had won a battle in the snow. Then it was Prussia's turn, Prussia the Proud, the land of the great soldier king of the century before, Prussia that had the finest army in Europe, or believed it did, which is not always quite the same thing. Prussia gathered its courage and marched against him, and in a single day, upon 2 battlefields not far apart, at a place called Jena and another called Auerstedt, he and his marshals shattered that famous army so utterly, so swiftly, so completely, that the whole proud kingdom fell to pieces in a matter of weeks, its fortresses surrendering almost as fast as his cavalry could ride up and knock upon their gates. It was less a war than a demonstration, and it left him, in the space of a single autumn, the master of Germany from the Rhine deep into the east. There is a strange, sad lesson tucked away in the fall of Prussia, and it is worth turning over gently as the lamp burns down, for the Prussians had grown so proud of the victories of their great-grandfathers that they had quite forgotten to keep their army in step with the changing times, and they marched to war in the old careful, slow-moving way of an earlier age against a man who had reinvented what war even was, and they were beaten before the first shot, beaten by their own contentment, beaten by the comfortable certainty that because a thing had once worked splendidly, it must work splendidly forever. It is a lesson that every proud and successful thing forgets sooner or later, whether it be an army, or an empire, or a company, or a man. The lesson that the world does not stand still to admire your past triumphs, and it is worth noticing, quietly, that the very man who taught Prussia this hard lesson in the autumn of 1806 would himself forget it utterly within a few short years, and would go marching off in his turn into the vastness of the East with the comfortable certainty that because a thing had always worked before it must work again. But that is a story for other, colder chapters, and we are not there yet, and there is no need to hurry toward it. And then, having beaten Austria and beaten Prussia, there was only Russia left of the great powers of the continent, only the young Tsar Alexander and his vast cold empire still standing against him. And after one more hard-fought campaign in the eastern mud and snow, the two of them, the Corsican emperor and the Russian Tsar, agreed at last to meet and to make peace. And they made it in one of the strangest and most theatrical settings any two rulers ever chose. For they met, in the summer of the year 1807, not in a palace and not in a tent, but in the middle of a river. On the wide slow river Niemen, at a town called Tilsit, their engineers built a great raft and moored it in the current midway between the two banks. And upon that raft they raised a fine pavilion, and there out on the water, with their two armies watching from the two shores, the master of the west and the master of the east came together to divide the world between them. Picture it, softly, as you drift, the broad grey river, the gaudy raft rocking gently on the slow current, the two young men, for they were both still young, stepping out to embrace each other like brothers before the eyes of half of Europe, and then sitting down together to share out the continent the way two travellers at an inn might share out a loaf and a bottle. This part for you and that part for me, this king to keep his throne and that one to lose it, this land to be yours and that land to be mine. It was the summit. It was the very top of the mountain, the highest point of the whole long climb that had begun on a rocky island nearly 40 years before. He was not yet 40 years of age, and he was, in that summer, on that raft, in that river, more nearly the master of Europe than any single man had been since the fall of Rome. From the Atlantic almost to the borders of Russia, kings ruled where he allowed them to rule and trembled when he frowned, and a great many of the thrones of the continent were filled by his own brothers and his own marshals and his own friends, and the map itself seemed to have been redrawn to his design. There was, in that summer of Tilsit, almost nothing left within his reach that he had not already reached, almost nothing left to take that he had not already taken, and a stranger thing than any battle now began quietly to happen to him, though he would not have called it a misfortune and might have laughed at the very idea. He was running out of things to conquer nearby, and that, though no fog gathered and no drum sounded to announce it, is a more dangerous condition for a man like that than any battlefield. For a man who has built his whole self out of the act of climbing, does not know, has never learned, cannot imagine, what to do once he has reached the top and there is no higher place to go. His poor secretaries, at least, might have hoped for a little rest now that the wars had paused, though they hoped in vain, for a man who cannot stop conquering the world will settle, in the quiet hours, for conquering the paperwork, and there was always more paperwork. And so we leave him there, on the high calm plateau of his fortunes, out on the gently rocking raft in the middle of the summer river, embracing an emperor and dividing a continent, not yet 40, master of nearly all he could see, with the whole of Europe spread out below him like a map upon a table, and the lamp of his fortunes burning as bright and as high as it would ever burn. It was as far up the mountain as the road would go, and the only direction left, though the summer sun on the river gave no sign of it, and he himself gave no sign of knowing it, was down. And so we come to the widest hour of the whole long story. The hour when the map of Europe had very nearly become a single drawing made by a single hand, and when a man who had begun as a poor boy on a rocky island could look out from Paris and know that his name was spoken, with love or with dread, in almost every town and village between the cold Atlantic surf and the warm rim of the Mediterranean. It is worth resting here a while, in this bright, gilded, slightly unreal moment before the tide begins its slow turning, because the years from 1807 to the eve of the Russian adventure are the years in which the empire shone at its very brightest, and, at the same time, in the quietest and least noticeable of ways, began to crack. There was no thunderclap. There was no single evening on which everything changed. There was only the gentle, almost imperceptible truth, which you may have noticed in your own life on a smaller scale, that a thing built too large begins, by the mere fact of its largeness, to pull against itself, the way a tree that grows too broad for its roots will lean, ever so slightly, into the wind. Let the lamp stay low, Let your shoulders go on sinking into the warmth of wherever you are lying. We are only going to watch, very slowly, how the greatest empire in the memory of living men reached its farthest edge, and then, without hurry and without alarm, began to come home. After the raft on the river at Tilsit, after the young Tsar of Russia and the Emperor of the French had divided the continent between them like two travellers sharing a loaf, Napoleon returned to a France, and to an Europe arranged more thoroughly around his single will than any land had been arranged around one person for a very long time indeed. He was not yet 40 years of age. He had crowned himself. He had broken every army sent against him. He had wound up the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire as calmly as a man closing an old ledger, and he had set his own relatives, one after another, upon the thrones of the oldest kingdoms of the continent. It is a strange and rather charming thing to consider, if you let yourself drift with it, that the same brothers and sisters who had once squabbled over bread and precedence in a crowded house in Ajaccio were now, each of them, being handed a country. His eldest brother Joseph, the steady, cautious, faintly melancholy one, was made a king, first of Naples and then, fatefully, of Spain. His younger brother Louis, dutiful and unhappy, was set upon the throne of Holland, where he committed the unforgivable crime, in his imperial brother's eyes, of actually caring more for the Dutch than for the blockade. His youngest brother Jerome, the pleasure-loving one, the one who liked uniforms and parties, was given the freshly invented kingdom of Westphalia, stitched together out of German lands like a coat made from other people's cloth. His sisters were married to princes or given principalities of their own, and his marshals, the tough, scarred, often unlettered soldiers who had risen with him out of the smoke of a dozen battlefields, were showered with dukedoms and grand titles drawn from the names of the very fields on which they had bled. It was, if you stand far enough back, a family business of an almost comic scale, an island clan that had spread itself across a continent, and the mother of that clan, the strict and frugal Laetitia, watched it all with a wary, unsmiling eye, tucking money away, unconvinced by the gold and the ermine, murmuring in her practical way the phrase that would follow her all her life, that it was all very fine if only it lasts. She, at least, was never fooled. She had seen too many tides go out to trust a tide that was still coming in, and she was right to save her coins, though it would take some years yet for the reason to become plain. Picture, if you will, the strange geometry of it. The way a family that had once measured its whole world by the length of a single narrow street in a single small town on a single rocky island now measured that world in kingdoms, so that a letter written by one brother to another might travel from Madrid to Warsaw, from a palace in the south to a palace in the north, all of it addressed, in the end back to the same crowded childhood, the same tired, shrewd, unimpressed mother folding her hands and waiting to see whether any of it would hold. There is something almost tender in it, and something almost absurd, and the two feelings sit together very comfortably in the quiet of the night, the way most true things do. For these thrones, splendid as they looked, were not gifts freely given so much as posts assigned, and the brothers and sisters who filled them were expected, above all else, to serve the system, to enforce the great blockade, to raise the taxes and the regiments the empire required, and to remember, always, that they reigned not in their own right, but as extensions of one man's will, which is a difficult thing to remember when one is wearing a crown, and several of them being human, forgot now. To hold all of this together, to keep so many crowns turning in the same direction, Napoleon relied upon two great instruments, and it is worth looking gently at both, because the tragedy of these years, if we can use so heavy a word in so soft a voice, is that both of his great instruments carried, folded quietly inside them, the seeds of his undoing. The first instrument was the army, the Grande Army, the finest and most experienced fighting force in the world, hardened by campaign after campaign, devoted to him with a devotion that is difficult to describe to people who have never seen it, calling him, among themselves, not by any grand imperial title, but by the old affectionate nickname from the days of Italy, the Little Corporal, as though he were still one of their own, and had merely, by some understandable accident, ended up wearing a crown. The second instrument was not a sword at all, but an idea, an economic idea, a great sprawling piece of commercial machinery that he called the Continental System. And here we must slow down and breathe, because this is the true beginning of the trouble, and it is a very quiet beginning, the sort of thing that would make a dull chapter in a school textbook, and yet is the hinge on which the entire fate of the empire silently turned. The problem, put as simply as it can be put, was Britain. Britain would not be beaten. Britain sat across her strip of grey water, protected by the greatest navy in the world, the same navy that had burned his fleet at the mouth of the Nile and had broken the combined fleets of France and Spain off a cape called Trafalgar. And behind that wall of ships, Britain grew richer and richer, trading with the whole world, lending money to every king who would take up arms against France, and remaining, year after year, stubbornly, infuriatingly out of reach. Napoleon could not get at her with soldiers, for he had no ships to carry them across. So he reached instead for the only weapon left to him, and it was a weapon aimed not at Britain's armies, but at Britain's purse. If he could not sink her trade, he would strangle it. He would close every port on the continent of Europe to British goods and British ships, from the north of Norway to the toe of Italy, from Portugal to the frontier of Russia, and he would keep them closed, and Britain, that nation of shopkeepers as the old jibe had it, would find her warehouses full and her buyers gone, and her wealth would rot on the docks, and she would be forced, in the end, to come to terms. It was on paper, and Napoleon was a great believer in what things looked like on paper. A beautiful plan, cold and logical and complete. There was only one difficulty with it, and it is the sort of difficulty that a man surrounded by yes and flattered by success tends not to hear until it is much too late. The difficulty was that to strangle Britain's trade, he first had to strangle a great deal of everybody else's, and the everybody else in question was the whole of the continent he ruled. For it turned out, as it always turns out, that ordinary people rather liked British goods. They liked cheap British cloth, and British sugar, and British coffee, and the 1,000 small comforts that came in British bottoms from every corner of the wider world. Merchants in Hamburg and Amsterdam, and Bordeaux and Genoa had built their whole lives on that trade, and when the ports slammed shut those merchants, did not blame the British, who were far away across the water. They blamed the man in Paris who had shut the ports, which was nearer the truth and considerably nearer to home. And so the blockade, which was meant to make Britain hate him, made instead a slow, spreading, grumbling resentment rise up among the very peoples he had conquered. A resentment that did not shout and did not rebel, not yet, but simply sat there. In shuttered warehouses and idle harbours, and the pinched faces of men who could no longer sell their goods, growing quietly, the way damp grows behind a wall. It is one of the gentle ironies of his whole story, and there are many, that the weapon he forged to defeat his one unconquered enemy became, in the using of it, the thing that turned his conquered friends against him. He had wanted to isolate an island. Instead, he had begun, very slowly and without meaning to isolate himself. And to make matters worse, in the sly way that these things compound, a blockade is only as strong as its weakest gate, and every closed port was a temptation. And where there is a temptation and a profit there is smuggling. And where there is smuggling there is a need to police it. And so this grand economic idea, meant to end a war, quietly required him to reach out his hand and take direct hold of more and more of the coastline of Europe, annexing this stretch and occupying that one, swallowing the papal territories, swallowing the coast of Holland when poor Louis proved too soft to enforce the rules, swallowing the German shore of the North Sea, until the empire on the map grew larger even as underneath. It grew more brittle, like a bubble that shines more brilliantly the thinner its skin is stretched. You may draw from this whatever quiet lesson you like as you drift towards sleep, but I will only note, in passing, and with the driest possible affection, that a plan requiring you to annoy every single one of your neighbours, all at once, forever, in order to inconvenience a nation of shopkeepers, is perhaps not quite so beautiful in the living as it looked upon the page, and consider the small ironies that gathered in the folds of it, for the man who had built the tidiest state in Europe, who had given France her clean new roads and her orderly new laws, now found himself the head of the largest and most enthusiastic smuggling network the world had ever accidentally created, since goods forbidden at the front door will always, without fail, find their way in at the back. And half of Europe spent these years quietly buying British coffee out of the sides of wagons, and drinking it, one imagines, with a certain private satisfaction. Even his own soldiers, it was said, marched to war in coats whose good wool had come, by roundabout and unmentionable paths, from the very island they were meant to be ruining. There is a lesson in that too, about the difference between what a man decrees and what people actually do. But the hour is late, and the difference is one that every ruler learns eventually, usually too slowly, and always at some expense. Nowhere did the resentment turn to open fire more disastrously than in Spain, and it is to Spain that we must go now, gently, for Spain is the first true wound. The one that never healed, the one he himself, in a rare moment of rueful honesty, would come to call the Spanish ulcer. Spain had been, in a manner of speaking, his ally, a tired old Bourbon kingdom ruled by a foolish king and a scheming favourite, quarrelling within its own royal family, weak and corrupt and ripe, or so it seemed to a man accustomed to reaching out and taking for tidy improvement. And so, in 1808, in one of the coldest and least admirable moves of his whole career, Napoleon lured the squabbling Spanish royals across the border into France, sat them down, took their crown away from all of them at once, and handed it, still warm, to his brother Joseph, moving the melancholy Joseph up from Naples to reign over a country that had never asked for him and did not want him. It was, as a piece of cold family arrangement, entirely in keeping with everything he had done for a decade. He had made kings before, and the kingdoms had accepted them. He assumed Spain would accept one too. He had for once entirely misread the people he was dealing with, and the misreading would cost him more, in the end, than any lost battle, because the Spanish, proud and poor and devout and stubborn, did not accept it, and did not sit quietly, and did not send polite delegations. They rose. Not in one great army that he could find and smash in an afternoon, for that was the kind of enemy he understood and loved, an enemy who would line up in a field and let himself be broken. No, the Spanish rose in 1,000 small places at once, in the hills and the villages and the dry brown ranges of that hard country, in bands and fragments and furious little companies, giving the world along the way a new word for this kind of war, a Spanish word, the little war, the guerrilla. They cut the roads. They fell upon stragglers and couriers and supply trains and vanished back into the rocks before the soldiers could form up. They gave no rest and asked no quarter, and were given none. And it was cruel and endless and unwinnable, a war with no single heart that he could pierce. A war that could not be won by winning battles, because it did not offer any battles to win. Only a country that bled and would not stop bleeding and swallowed army after French army into its dust. And behind the guerrillas landing on the coast and holding on with the stubborn patience for which they were becoming famous, came the British, the redcoats under a lean and careful general, who would later have a great deal more to do with our story. A man who did not throw his soldiers away, who dug in and held the high ground and waited, and turned the whole of that peninsula into a slow, grinding, bottomless drain into which the strength of the empire ran away, quietly, year after year, while the emperor's gaze, fatally, was fixed elsewhere. That is the thing to hold on to here, softly, as the picture darkens by only a shade. It was not that Spain was lost in a day. It was that Spain was never won, and never finished, and never left alone, and so it went on consuming men and money and attention the whole time. A low fever that never broke, draining him even in the years when he seemed everywhere else to be triumphant. He could have made peace there. He could have given Spain back its own king, and cut his losses, and turned to face the true dangers gathering elsewhere. But he could not, and here we touch the deepest and gentlest truth of his whole character, the flaw that was only the far side of his greatness, which was simply that he could not stop, could not let a thing go, could not leave well enough alone, could not bear to give back anything he had once taken, because to give back was to admit a limit, and he had built his entire astonishing life upon the faith that for him there were no limits at all. Now let us leave the dry hills of Spain and come home to Paris, to a quieter and more human trouble, one that has nothing to do with blockades or guerrillas, and everything to do with the oldest anxiety of every dynasty ever founded, which is the simple, aching question of who comes after. For all his crowns and all his conquests, Napoleon had no son. He had married, years before, for love and for luck, the older Creole widow Josephine, with her Caribbean warmth and her extravagance and her debts and her charm, and he had loved her, in his overwhelming and difficult way, more than he ever quite admitted, and she had given him no child. She had children of her own, from her first marriage, but between the two of them, between the emperor and his empress, there was no heir, and an empire without an heir is a house built on a single life, and he knew, better than anyone, how fragile a single life could be, for he risked his own on a battlefield most summers, and so there ripened, slowly and painfully, over these years, the decision that may be the saddest small thing in the whole vast story, sadder in its quiet human way than any lost battle, which was that he must put Josephine aside. Not because he had ceased to love her, for by every account he had not, but precisely because the empire he had built demanded it, and the empire, in the end, always came first. The divorce, when it came, was a strange and mournful piece of theatre, all the more moving for its restraint, an occasion of ermine and candlelight in which two people who genuinely cared for one another were separated by the machinery of state that one of them had built, and Josephine, weeping, kept her title and her palaces, and, it is said, a measure of his heart to the end of her days, while he went looking, with cold dynastic purpose, for a young wife who could give him the son that everything now hung upon. He found her in Austria, of all places, in the household of the very Habsburg dynasty he had beaten and humbled again and again, an arrangement so improbable that it has a kind of dark comedy to it, for the bride chosen for him, the Archduchess Marie-Louise, was the daughter of the Austrian Emperor, one of his oldest and most defeated enemies, a young woman raised, quite literally, to fear and loathe the Corsican ogre, and now handed to him across a wedding table to seal a peace and breed a prince. She was young and pale and dutiful, and by most accounts they got on far better than either of them can have expected, and whatever else the marriage was, it worked in the one respect that mattered most to him. For in the spring of 1811 the cannon of Paris began to fire, and the whole city stopped to count the shots, because everyone knew the arrangement that a certain number would mean a daughter and a greater number would mean a son and an heir. And the guns went on firing past the count for a girl and into the count for a boy, and the city, or so the story goes, erupted, and Napoleon had his son at last, a small pink prince styled, with all the grandeur the age could muster, the king of Rome, the heir to a continent, the child in whom the whole enormous, improbable edifice of the empire found, for one shining moment, a future. It is a lovely image to rest on, if you let it come to you softly in the dark, the hard, driven, tireless emperor, who had trusted almost no one and rested almost never, sitting with a baby in his arms in a quiet room while outside the guns still echoed, an ordinary father in an extraordinary story, holding the one thing his whole ferocious life had finally, at great cost, produced. And you might think, watching that scene, that here at last he had everything, that here the story might gently stop, a man of barely more than 40 with a continent at his feet, a devoted army, a fertile young empress, a healthy son, and a name that would surely now settle into the long calm of an established dynasty. You might think, and I suspect the whole of Europe rather hoped, that having reached the summit he would at last be content to sit upon it. But we come now to the last and quietest of the cracks, the one inside the man himself, the one that no code of law or clever blockade could ever have mended, and it is this, said as softly as I can say it, so as not to disturb the peace of the room. He did not know how to stop. He had never known how to stop. Everything he had won by moving forward, by daring the next thing and the next, by treating every summit as merely the base of the next mountain. And a man who has succeeded so completely by never being satisfied does not, cannot, suddenly learn to be satisfied at the very moment when satisfaction would save him. And out to the east, across the plains of Poland, beyond the frontier of his enormous empire, there sat the one great power that had slipped free of his web, the one throne he did not control, the one gate in his continental wall that would not stay shut. Russia, his old partner from the raft at Tilsit, the young Tsar with whom he had once divided the world like two friends over a meal, had grown cold. Russia was vast and proud and far away, and Russia was quietly reopening her ports to British trade because the blockade was ruining her too, breaking the very system on which Napoleon had staked everything. And Russia, being enormous and distant and possessed of a Tsar who no longer feared him, could not be reached by threats the way his nearer neighbours could. And so the same logic that had drawn him into Spain, the logic that could never leave a defiance unanswered or a limit unchallenged, began, slowly and terribly, and with a kind of dreadful calm, to turn his mind eastward, to whisper that the way to master Britain was, absurdly, to march to the other end of Europe and force the last great holdout back into line, to overawe Russia so completely that the whole system would snap shut at last, and the long war would finally be won. There was no need for it. That is the thing to hold, gently, as we close. There was no need. He had a son, a continent, an empire, a peace he could have kept. Every wise voice around him, and there were a few brave enough to raise them, counselled against it, spoke of the distances, the winters, the roads that were not roads, the sheer swallowing size of the land. But the size of the thing, which should have warned him, seemed instead only to draw him, as a great blank space on a map has always drawn the kind of man who cannot bear a blank space, and slowly, through the last months of 1811 and into the early part of 1812, the decision hardened from a possibility into a certainty. And once it was certain, the machinery of the largest empire the modern world had seen began to turn toward the making of the largest army the world had ever known. From every corner of his enormous domain they came, and this is the last image I will leave with you tonight, and I want you to see it not with dread, but with the wide, sorrowful calm of a thing seen from very far away and very long ago. Frenchmen and Italians and Poles and Germans and Dutchmen and men from a dozen smaller nations, drawn up out of every province and principality of the empire, marching in their hundreds of thousands toward the eastern frontier, more than 500,000 men in the end, an army so vast that it could not be fed from any one country, and had to drink whole regions dry as it passed, guns beyond counting, horses beyond counting, wagons and pontoons and eagles gleaming in the summer sun, gathering and massing all through the warm months of that year upon the banks of a river at the edge of the Russian land, the greatest force ever assembled by one will, glittering, enormous, confident, endless, streaming eastward into the long light of a summer evening toward a country that had already decided, in its patient and terrible way, not to fight him at all, but simply to fall back, and back, and back, and let him come. He looked at that army, and he saw the instrument of a final victory. We, sitting here in the warm and the dark, 200 years downstream, know something that he, for all his genius, did not, or would not, let himself know, and it is nothing so crude as a battle or a blunder. It is only the weather, it is only the coming of the cold. The vast host was gathering in the sunshine of high summer, and the snow, far off, over the curve of the world, was already waiting, in no hurry at all, for it had all the time there is, and it knew, as the snow always knows, that the sunshine does not last. But that is for another night. For now let the great army stand in the summer light at the edge of the world, its banners bright, its story not yet arrived, and let yourself go on sinking, softly, into the warm and the still, while the lamp burns low and the long day rests, at last, quietly beside you. And so we come to the summer of 1812, and to the great river, and to the army so large that no one who saw it ever quite found the words for it afterward. The river was the Niemen, a slow brown border water on the edge of the Russian world, and across it, in the warm haze of late June, the Grande Army began to pour. It came on in columns that stretched back over the hills and out of sight, and it kept coming, hour after hour, day after day, until the watching officers gave up counting and simply let it flow. 600,000 men, or something near it, the largest army that Europe had ever gathered in one place and pointed in one direction. And here is the first strange thing about that army, the thing worth settling into as the lamp grows dim. It was not really a French army at all. It was drawn from 20 nations and more. There were Frenchmen, of course, but there were also Poles and Italians and Dutchmen, Bavarians and Saxons and Württembergers, Austrians and Prussians marching under a flag they did not love, Portuguese and Spaniards and Croats and Swiss, men who spoke a dozen languages and worshipped in half a dozen ways, all of them folded into the vast machine of one man's will and carried eastward toward A. Country most of them could not have found on a map. It was, in its way, the whole of Napoleon's Europe on the move, the entire continent he had rearranged, poured into a single glittering flood and sent across a river toward the one great power that had slipped, quietly and stubbornly, out of his grasp. It looked, that summer, like the most certain thing in the world. He had beaten everyone. He had beaten the Austrians and the Prussians and the Russians before, more than once, on fields whose names had become the names of his glory. And he had every reason to believe that he would do it again, quickly, in one or two great battles, before the leaves turned. That was the plan, if so loose a hope can be called a plan, to march in, to force the Russians to stand and fight, to break them in a single afternoon of thunder as he had broken so many others, and to dictate a peace before the cold came. It was a reasonable plan for a man who had never yet been given a lesson in the one subject he had never studied, which was patience against an enemy who simply would not oblige him. Because the Russians, it turned out, had a plan of their own, and it was the cruelest plan imaginable for a conqueror in a hurry. They would not fight. They would not stand. They would give him the one thing he could not use, which was empty space. All through that long, hot summer, the army marched east into a country that seemed to open and open before it and never close, and the Russian armies fell back, and back, and back again, always just out of reach, always over the next horizon, drawing the great glittering flood deeper and deeper into a vastness that had no edges. And behind them as they went, the Russians burned. They burned the standing grain in the fields. They burned the villages and the granaries and the hay. They drove off the cattle and fouled the wells and left the land a scorched and smoking emptiness for the invaders to march through, so that the greatest army in the world found itself advancing not into a rich country to be plundered, but into a desert that its own enemy had made. And an army, however brave, however loyal, however brilliantly led, is in the end a very large number of men and horses who must eat every single day, and there was less and less for them to eat. The horses began to die first on the long dusty roads in the sudden hard rains for want of fodder, and when the horses die, the guns cannot move, and the wounded cannot be carried, and the whole vast machine begins, very slowly and very quietly, to come apart at the joints. Men fell out of the columns by the thousand, sick, footsore, starving, straggling, and the army that had crossed the Niemen 600,000 strong was already, before it had fought a single great battle, a good deal smaller than the number that had set out. This is the part that the paintings never show, the slow subtraction that happens on the roads, in the heat, in the mud, in the emptiness, the way a great army wastes away, not in the thunder of battle, but in the long grey business of simply trying to keep moving forward through a land that has been stripped bare to starve it. There is a dry little truth hidden in all of this, and it is worth turning over gently as you lie there in the dark, the most brilliant general who ever lived. The man who could look at a battlefield and see, in a single glance, the one hill that decided everything, had finally met an opponent he could not outthink, and that opponent was not a man at all. It was distance. It was weather. It was the simple, patient, unhurried indifference of a very large and very cold country that had all the time in the world and needed only to wait. You cannot outflank the horizon. You cannot order the snow to hold off another week. You cannot win a battle against an enemy who declines to appear. And Napoleon, who had spent his whole life making the world move faster than it wished to, marched deeper and deeper into a country that had decided, very calmly, to move slower than he could afford. At last, in early September, near a village called Borodino, some 70 miles or so short of Moscow, the Russians turned and stood. They had retreated as far as their own pride and their own capital would let them, and now, on a wide rolling field crossed with streams and studded with hastily thrown-up earthworks, they planted themselves and waited to be attacked. And Napoleon, who had wanted a great battle above all things, who had marched half across a continent to get one, finally got it, and it was the most terrible thing he had ever seen. Borodino was not a battle of manoeuvre and genius, of the clever hill and the sudden collapse. It was a battle of standing still and killing, hour upon hour, a great grinding head-on collision of two exhausted armies hammering at each other across a few square miles of trampled ground from dawn until dark. The guns fired until the barrels were too hot to touch. The smoke lay so thick across the field that the sun turned to a dull red coin behind it. Men went forward into the earthworks and were thrown back and went forward again over their own dead, and the little redoubts changed hands, and changed hands again, and were buried in bodies. By the end of that single day, tens of thousands of men on each side were dead or dying on that field, more than had fallen in any single day of any of his other wars, and the sun went down on a slaughter that neither side could truly call a victory. The Russians drew off in good order, bloodied but unbroken, still an army. And Napoleon held the field, which is the old soldier's definition of winning, and yet he had won nothing at all, because the enemy he had come so far to destroy had slipped away once more into the vastness, hurt but alive, leaving him standing among the dead with the road to Moscow open before him and no peace in his hand. There is a weariness that settles over the story here, and it is the right weariness for this hour. The weariness of a man who keeps getting exactly what he asked for and finding that it is not what he needed. He had asked for a great battle, and he had been given the bloodiest day of his life, and it had decided nothing. He had asked for Moscow, and now he would be given Moscow too, and that would decide nothing either. A week or so after Borodino, in the middle of September, the Grande Army, or what was left of it, came up over the last low hills and saw the city spread out below them in the autumn light, the strange and beautiful city of Moscow, with its hundreds of churches and its painted domes and its great red fortress at the heart of it, glittering there in the distance like something out of a dream. And the soldiers, ragged and starving and half dead from the long march, raised a great ragged cheer at the sight of it, because Moscow meant the end. Moscow meant shelter and food and warm houses and an end to the marching, and surely, the fall of the enemy's holy capital would bring the Tsar to terms at last, and then they could all go home. They marched down into the city, and the city was silent. This is the second strange thing, and the eeriest, and it is worth holding in the mind gently, the way you might hold a cold, smooth stone. Moscow was empty, not besieged, not defended, not burning, not even, at first, particularly damaged. It was simply, almost entirely, empty. The governor had ordered the city abandoned, and the great mass of its people had gone, streaming out of the far side even as the French came in at the near, so that the conquerors found themselves marching into a hushed and hollow capital, their footsteps echoing down deserted streets, past shuttered shops and silent palaces and churches with no one in them to pray. An emperor likes to be met. He likes the keys of the city brought out to him, the delegation of frightened notables, the formal surrender, the visible proof that he has won. And Moscow gave him none of it. Moscow gave him silence and empty rooms, and the strangest victory of his life, the capture of a great city that had nobody left in it to notice that it had been captured. And then, on the very first night, the fires began. No one has ever been entirely sure who started them, or how many hands were in it, but they began here and there, small at first, a warehouse, a row of wooden houses, and then more, and then more, and the autumn wind came up and took them, and by the second night the fires had joined and spread and become one great fire, a sea of flame rolling through the wooden city, leaping the narrow streets, throwing sparks the size of fists into the black sky until the whole of Moscow seemed to be burning at once. The French soldiers, who had marched 1,000 miles to find warm houses at last, watched the warm houses go up in a wall of fire that drove them back into the streets and the squares, and the great red fortress at the heart of the city was ringed with flame, and the man who had come to accept the surrender of Russia stood at a high window and watched his prize turn to ash and smoke in front of him. When it was over, days later, most of the city was gone, a black and smoking waste of fallen timber and standing chimneys, and there he was, the master of Europe, the emperor of the French, the conqueror of the ancient capital of the Tsars, camped in the ruins of a burned city 1,000 miles from home, at the very end of a road he had stripped bare behind him, with winter coming on, and no one at all, coming forward to make peace. Here is where the story slows almost to stillness, into the long, patient, terrible waiting that is the hinge of the whole disaster. Because he waited. He sat in the ashes of Moscow, in what was left of the great fortress, and he waited for the Tsar to send word, to open talks, to admit that the game was lost, as any reasonable ruler who had lost his capital surely must. He wrote letters, he made offers, he was sure, with the sureness of a man who had bent every other king in Europe to his will, that the peace would come, that it was only a matter of a week, of a few more days, of a little more patience. And the days went by, and the Tsar said nothing, because the Tsar had understood the one thing that Napoleon, for all his genius, had refused to let himself understand, that he did not need to answer at all. He needed only to wait and let the calendar do the fighting, and let the cold come down out of the north and finish what the empty roads had begun. And so October slipped away in that ruined city, while the master of the world sat waiting for a letter that was never going to arrive, and the first cold nights came, and still he waited, and by the time he finally admitted that no peace was coming, and gave the order to turn back, it was already, in the quiet arithmetic of that country, too late. The retreat from Moscow is one of the great sorrows of history, and the sleep register is, strangely, the truest way to tell it, because it was not a sudden catastrophe, but a long, slow going out, like a tide withdrawing down a cold beach, like a lamp guttering lower and lower through a long night, until at last there is only the dark. They set out in the middle of autumn, the ragged remnant of the great army, hoping to march back through richer country to the south. But the Russians blocked that road, and so they were forced back onto the very same highway they had come by, the long, straight, scorched road through the country they had already stripped to the bone, where there was nothing left to eat because they themselves had eaten it, and nothing left to burn because it had already burned. And then the snow began. It came early that year, the way the old country always seemed to know how to do, softly at first, a dusting on the frozen ruts, and then in earnest, and behind the snow came the cold, the deep, still, iron cold of the Russian winter, colder than the men from Italy and Spain and the soft green valleys of France had ever imagined cold could be. And the great army, already starving, already exhausted, began now to freeze as it walked. The horses died in their traces and were butchered where they fell, so that the guns had to be abandoned, spiked and left standing in the snow, the beautiful guns that had won the emperor his crown, left behind like broken toys. The wagons were abandoned, the wounded were abandoned, because there was no way to carry them and no warmth to keep them, and they were left sitting in the snow by the roadside as the column trudged past, and the snow covered them. Men fell out of the march and sat down to rest for a moment in the terrible cold, and the cold, which is patient and gentle in its own way, let them fall asleep, and they did not get up again. The long road east was strewn, mile after mile, with the dark shapes of the fallen, half buried in the drifting white, and over them came the crows, and behind them, always harrying the ragged column, cutting off the stragglers, came the Cossacks on their shaggy ponies, out of the grey distance and back into it. It is almost unbearable, told plainly, and so we will not tell it plainly. We will only say, softly, that the greatest army the world had ever seen was unmaking itself along a frozen road, a few thousand fewer of it every single day, melting into the snow, and that there was nothing anyone could do to stop it, because the enemy now was not an army you could fight, but the weather itself, and the distance itself, and the long cold indifference of a country that had simply waited. And near the end of that dreadful road there was a river, the Berezina, and the river should have been frozen hard enough to walk across, and it was not. The weather, cruel in every direction at once, had thawed just enough to break the ice and fill the river with grinding floes, and the bridges were down, and the Russians were closing in on every side, and it seemed for a day or two that the whole broken remnant of the army would be pinned against that black water and destroyed there entirely. That they were not, that a part of them got across at all, was the work of the engineers and the pontoon builders who went down into that freezing river and stood in it, in water full of ice, holding up the trestles of 2 makeshift bridges with their own hands and shoulders, hour after hour, most of them dying of it, so that the army could stumble across on the swaying planks above them while the guns fired and the ice ran and men fell screaming into the water in the crush. The crossing of the Berezina became, ever after, the very word in France for catastrophe, for a disaster so complete that the name alone was enough. And on the far bank a fraction of the great host went on, a haggard, frost-bitten, staggering remnant, wrapped in whatever rags and stolen furs they could find. Hardly an army at all any more, hardly men. And behind them the river closed, and the snow came down and covered everything, the bridges and the guns and the fallen, and the whole long story of the road. Of the 600,000 and more who had crossed the Niemen that bright hopeful summer, only a small and pitiful fraction ever crossed back out of Russia alive. The rest were left behind in the vastness, in the fields of Borodino and the ashes of Moscow, and the drifts along the frozen road, and the black water of the Berezina, an entire Europe of young men gone into the snow. And Napoleon himself, seeing at last that the army was beyond saving, and that his throne at home might not be, did as he had done once before in Egypt. He left. He handed over what was left of the command, climbed into a fast sleigh, and raced ahead across the winter of Europe, back toward Paris, to raise a new army before his enemies could gather, leaving the frozen remnant to make its own terrible way home without him. There is a dry and bitter little observation to be made here, and we make it gently, without cruelty, as an old truth about the limits of even the greatest men. He had been beaten, at the last, not by a rival genius, not by a better general, but by the cold and the distance and his own refusal to turn back a month sooner than he did. All the brilliance in the world cannot argue with November in the north. The snow does not care how many battles you have won, and the road home which he had chosen to march his army down was the road he himself had burned. Now everything changed at once, the way it always does when a great power is seen to stumble. For years the kings and emperors of Europe had feared him, obeyed him, made unwilling peace with him, married their daughters to him, and bided their time. And now the news ran across the continent like the crack of ice on a thawing lake. The Grande Army was gone, destroyed, swallowed in the Russian snows, and the ogre was mortal after all. And one by one, and then all together, the old enemies rose. Prussia, which had been crushed and humbled and forced into his system, turned against him first, her people rising in a fever of what they were beginning to call their War of Liberation. Russia came on westward, following the retreat, no longer fleeing but hunting. Austria, which had given him his empress and pretended to be his friend, weighed the odds and slid, at last, into the ranks of his enemies. Sweden joined them, and the smaller German states began to slip their leashes one after another, and Britain, as ever, paid and armed and encouraged them all from behind her wall of ships. This was the Sixth Coalition, the greatest of all the alliances against him, and it gathered itself through the year 1813 with a grim and growing confidence. And Napoleon, back in France, worked his old miracle one more time and conjured a new army out of nothing, out of raw boys and old veterans, and every last reserve the exhausted country could give him. And with that green new army he went east again, into Germany, and fought. And here is the strange and sombre thing about that year. He still, even now, even with an army of boys, won battles. The old genius had not left him. He struck the coalition and beat it, here and there in this engagement and that, and for a while it seemed he might yet hold them off. But he could no longer win the war, because he could no longer replace what he lost, and they could, and every battle he won cost him men he could not spare, while the ring of his enemies only grew larger and closer around him. And in the middle of October, in the year 1813, all the strands of it drew together at last near the city of Leipzig, in Saxony, where the coalition armies converged from every direction and closed in upon him, and there was fought the greatest battle of the whole long age of Napoleon, a battle so huge that they gave it a name to match, the Battle of the Nations. For 3 days, more than 500,000 men struggled around the city of Leipzig, French and Poles and the last loyal Germans on one side, and on the other the Russians and Prussians and Austrians and Swedes, wave upon wave of them, more of them every hour, closing the ring tighter and tighter, while Napoleon fought in the centre with the cold brilliance of a cornered master. But there were simply too many of them now. In the middle of the battle, some of his German allies, the Saxons who had followed him for years, changed sides on the field itself and turned their guns around, and the ring drew closed, and there was nothing left to do but retreat, back westward, out of Germany altogether, back across the Rhine into France, with the coalition pouring after him. The empire east of the Rhine, the whole vast structure of client kingdoms and satellite states and grateful relatives on borrowed thrones, all of it that he had built over 15 glittering years, simply fell away behind him as he went, kingdom by kingdom, like snow sliding off a roof in the first thaw. And so the war came home, at last, to France itself, in the cold early months of 1814, which is a bitter place for any conqueror's story to arrive, the invasion of his own country, the enemy armies crossing the frontiers he had carried so far beyond, marching down the roads of France toward Paris. And here, in this last hopeless winter, defending the soil of France with an army of children and grandfathers against odds that no genius could truly mend, Napoleon fought what many who studied such things came to call the most brilliant campaign of his entire life. It is one of the quiet ironies of his whole story, and we lay it down softly for you to turn over as you drift, that he was never, perhaps greater as a soldier than in the weeks when he was surely losing, dashing his tiny army back and forth across the frozen fields of northern France, striking one enemy column and then wheeling to strike another, winning small, dazzling victories one after another against forces many times his size, holding off the impossible for week after week by sheer speed and will and the last deep reserves of his art. But you cannot in the end defeat all of Europe with an army of boys, however beautifully you move them. There were simply too many enemy columns, and while he chased one, the others came on toward Paris. And at the end of March, the great city, which had not seen an enemy at its gates in the whole of his lifetime, was reached, and fought over on its heights for a single day, and then gave itself up. Paris fell. And with Paris gone, the ground went out from under everything. His marshals, the men he had raised from nothing and made into dukes and princes, the comrades of 20 years of glory, were tired to the bone, and they looked at the ruin of the country, and the enemy and the capital, and the boys dying in the snow, and they would fight no more. They came to him, the great soldiers of the empire, and told him, as gently as such a thing can be told, that it was over, that the army would not march again, that there was nothing left to do but stop. And there was nothing left to do but stop. And so, in the first days of April, in the year 1814, in a quiet room at the palace of Fontainebleau, the man who had crowned himself Emperor of the French, who had beaten every army in Europe, and placed his brothers on half its thrones, and redrawn the map of the world with his own hand, sat down and abdicated, and gave it all up, and signed his name to the end of his empire. There is a great stillness in that room, and we will sit in it for just a moment, gently, without drama, the way you sit with something that is simply, finally, over. He tried at first to abdicate in favour of his little son, the King of Rome, so that the boy might reign in his place, but the victorious kings would have none of it. They wanted the whole line gone. And so in the end the abdication was complete and unconditional, everything surrendered, the crown, the empire, the future, all of it. And then, having taken everything, the Allies did a curious and almost mocking thing, a thing that has a strange, dry humour buried in its cruelty. They did not kill him. They did not imprison him in a fortress. Instead they gave him, by the terms of the treaty, a kingdom of his own to go to and to rule, a sovereign prince still, in name, with a title and a flag and a little court. Only the kingdom they gave him was a small rocky island in the Mediterranean, off the coast of Italy, an island called Elba, a place you could ride across in a single day. The man who had ruled from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia, who had commanded 600,000 men and worn the Iron Crown of Italy and made and unmade nations, was to be the emperor of a scrap of rock in the sea, some dozen or so miles across, with a few thousand inhabitants and a great deal of quiet. It is hard to imagine a sharper way of saying to a man that his time is over, not a dungeon, not a scaffold, but a toy. Here is your island, master of the world. Here is your empire now. Try to be content with it. And so, in the late spring of 1814, they put him aboard a ship, and the ship carried him south, away from France, away from his marshals and his armies and the burned cities and the frozen roads, away from Paris and away from his infant son, whom he would never see again, out across the calm blue water to the little green island waiting for him in the sun. He said his farewells to the old guard, the veterans of all the campaigns, and kissed the eagle of their standard, and then he was gone, over the sea, to Elba. And Europe, exhausted, bled white, sick to death of 20 years of war, breathed out at last, a long, slow breath of relief, and the kings came back to their capitals, and the old order settled itself back onto its throne, and everyone, everywhere, from the palaces of Vienna to the smallest cottage in the smallest village, believed with all their hearts that the long storm was finally over, that the great disturber of the peace had been safely put away on his little island, and that history, having heaved and thundered for a generation, could now go quietly back to sleep. He walked in the gardens of his little island and looked out at the sea, and the world let out its held breath, and believed that it was done. And it was not quite done, but that is a matter for another night. For now let it be enough that the great tide has gone out, all the way out, as far as a tide can go, that the man who could not stop is finally, forcibly, stopped, and that on a small warm island in a blue sea, in the gathering quiet of that summer, a great and terrible chapter of the world came softly, at last, to rest. And so we come to the last act of the long story, and to the quiet that settles over everything once the last act is done. We left him on the little island of Elba, a great man made small, sitting by the sea with a toy kingdom of a few thousand souls, some iron mines, a fishing fleet, and a coastline he could ride around in a single unhurried afternoon. The world, having exhaled its long breath of relief, believed the story was finished. Kings returned to their old chairs. Diplomats gathered in Vienna to redraw the map at their leisure, to dance and to bargain and to put the furniture of Europe back roughly where it had stood before the Corsican rearranged it. And on his speck of rock in the Mediterranean, the fallen emperor kept himself busy in the way that busy men do when they are given nothing to do. He reorganized the island. He planned roads. He inspected the mines and reviewed his handful of guards and laid out gardens, and, in the manner of a man who cannot help improving whatever is set in front of him, he began to run Elba the way he had once run a continent, only smaller and slower, and with a great deal more time left over at the end of each day to look out at the water. It is one of the gentle jokes of his life that even in exile he could not simply rest, give the man an island and he will tidy it. But he watched the sea more than he watched the roads. He heard, through the slow post and the gossip of travellers, that the new old rulers of France were already tiring the people, that the returned nobles wanted their lost lands back, that the soldiers who had followed the eagles across Europe were half pay and forgotten, that his name, which had been a curse in the drawing rooms, was becoming again a soft and dangerous music in the barracks and the fields. And he did what he had always done. He calculated. In the early spring of 1815, on a night when the one warship set to watch him happened to be away, he gathered his few hundred guardsmen and his handful of ships, and he slipped off Elba and pointed his little flotilla at the coast of France, and set sail toward a throne he had signed away, with no army but the memory of himself. It should have been madness. It very nearly was. He landed on the southern shore with a force so small it could have been arrested by a single determined regiment, and marched inland toward the mountains, toward Paris, gambling everything on one wager that the soldiers sent to stop him would not be able to fire. Near Grenoble the wager was tested. A body of royal troops was drawn up across the road, with orders to end the adventure then and there, muskets loaded, officers watchful. And the small grey figure in the familiar coat walked out alone in front of their guns, within easy range, and opened that coat and offered them the oldest and simplest argument he had. "Here I am," the gesture said. "If any of you wishes to kill your emperor, here he stands." And the soldiers, who had marched for him from Italy to the gates of Moscow, who had frozen and starved and buried their friends for him, and had never quite stopped loving him for it, broke their ranks and their orders and their new oaths, and ran to him instead, weeping, shouting the old cheer. And the regiment sent to arrest him became the vanguard of his march. It happened again and again on the road north. Regiment after regiment sent to block him went over to him instead, the tricolour cockade coming back out of 1,000 pockets where it had been hidden, so that he rolled toward the capital not as an invader, but as a returning tide, gathering the army to himself as he came, and reached Paris without firing a shot, and slept once more in the palace he had left the year before, having reconquered the whole of France with an open coat and a familiar face. Paris woke one morning to find the king gone in the night, and the eagles back over the palace, as though the whole return of the old order had been a long uneasy dream from which the city was only now waking. This was the strange, brief, luminous season that history calls the 100 Days, a last spring of empire, unearned and unlikely, warm and doomed. He set at once, in his tireless way, to putting the machinery of the state back in motion, drafting a new and gentler constitution, reviewing his returning soldiers, trying to persuade a wary Europe and a wary France that this time he came in peace, that he had learned, that he wished only to reign quietly over the country that had run to him on the roads. Almost no one believed it, and perhaps, in his heart, neither did he, but for a few warm weeks the tricolour flew again, and the old soldiers polished the old eagles, and it was possible, in the soft light of that spring, to imagine that the story might yet have a gentle ending. It would not. He knew, better than anyone, how little time it could last. The kings who had beaten him were still gathered at Vienna, and the moment they heard that he was loose again they stopped their dancing and declared, not war upon France, but war upon him personally, upon one man, and began to march their enormous armies toward the frontiers from every direction at once. He counted them, as he always counted, and saw that if he waited for them all to arrive together they would crush him by sheer weight. So he did the only thing his whole life had taught him to do. He gathered what army he could, quickly, and struck north into the Low Countries to fall upon the two nearest enemies, the British and their allies under the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussians under old Blucher before the others could come up, hoping to beat them one at a time and knock the coalition off balance before it closed its fist. And so the roads of what is now Belgium filled once more with marching men, and the whole vast argument of his life came down, at last, to a few square miles of Flemish farmland and a wet grey day in the middle of June, the 18th of June, 1815. It had rained in the night, rained hard, and the fields were heavy with mud, and because the ground was too soft to move the guns he loved, he waited through the morning for it to dry, and that waiting cost him hours he did not have. The armies faced each other across a shallow valley of rye and trampled wheat, the British line drawn up along a low ridge with its farmhouses and its hedges, and the French massed below, and between them a day that would go into every language as a single word, meaning the end of something. Waterloo. It was not a graceful battle. It was a long, brutal, close, exhausting day of frontal blows, the kind of straightforward hammering he had spent his career avoiding and was now reduced to, because he had no time left for elegance. His columns went up the slope against the ridge and were thrown back. His magnificent cavalry, thousands of horsemen, the pride of the army, swept in wave after glittering wave up against the British squares those patient hollow blocks of infantry, hedgehogs of bayonets, each one a little fortress of men standing shoulder to shoulder, the front rank kneeling with their muskets braced, the ranks behind firing over their heads, closing the gaps where men fell, standing and reloading and standing again, and the horsemen broke upon them like water on rock, again and again through the long afternoon, filling the trampled valley with fallen horses and drifting smoke, and could not shatter them, could not break a single square until the great cavalry of the Empire was spent and scattered on the slope, and the squares still stood. The farmhouses in front of the line were fought for room by room, all day, and mostly held. And all through the afternoon he kept glancing to his right, to the east, waiting for a marshal he had sent to keep the Prussians away, waiting for that corps to appear on the horizon and fall upon the enemy flank and decide the thing. He waited for the wrong army, and the right one came instead. For the dark shapes that at last emerged from the woods on his right were not his own missing marshal returning in triumph, but Blucher and the Prussians, the beaten Prussians of 2 days before, who had promised Wellington they would come, and who had dragged themselves across broken country through the same mud to keep that promise, arriving in the late day, exactly where they were least wanted. From that moment the arithmetic was against him, and the arithmetic had always been his god. He threw in his last and best, the veteran guard that had never yet been beaten, sent them up the slope in the failing light in one final effort to break the centre before the Prussian weight told and the line held. And the guard, the immortal guard, wavered and stopped, and for the first time in its history fell back. And when the army saw the guard recoiling, the heart went out of it, and the whole great structure came apart at once, the retreat turning to rout in the dusk with the Prussian cavalry loosed upon it, and by nightfall the last army of the Emperor of the French was a stream of fugitives on the road south. And the long adventure that had begun in the fog at Toulon was over, finished. On a muddy ridge in the rain, in a single day. He rode back toward Paris a beaten man, and this time there was no rabbit out of any hat, no brilliant recovery, no waiting reserve. The politicians who had welcomed him in the spring now asked him coldly to go, and he had no soldiers left to argue with them. So for the second time he laid down the crown, quietly, at the same desk almost, signing away the same empire he had signed away the year before, only this time knowing it was truly the end. He thought for a while of slipping across the sea to America, of vanishing into that enormous new country and beginning again as an ordinary man, and the British ships watching every port made sure he could not. And so, in the end, having run out of roads and run out of armies and run out of countries that would have him, he did the last calculating thing of his calculating life, and chose his enemy. He would not be handed to the vengeful royalists of France, nor to the Prussians who wanted him shot, nor to the Austrians, nor to the Russians. He surrendered himself instead to the British, to the navy that had hunted him for 20 years and never quite caught him, walking aboard one of their warships of his own accord and placing himself with a certain grand and theatrical dignity under the protection of the most stubborn of all his foes, throwing himself, as he put it, upon the hospitality of the British people. The British people, or at least their government, were not feeling hospitable. They had learned the expensive way that no island close to Europe could hold him, that Elba had been a laughable mistake, that this man given a coastline and a warship's inattention would simply come back. So they chose, this time, the farthest and loneliest place on all their maps, far out in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from anywhere, halfway between Africa and South America and near to neither. There is a small volcanic rock in an empty ocean, a place ships called at to take on water on the long haul home, and otherwise forgot a green and cloudy speck of cliffs and mist, called St. Helena. There was no nearer land for a week's hard sailing in any direction. There was no shore he could walk to, no coast he could ride around and improve, no regiment within 1,000 leagues of the sea that could weep and come over to him. It was, quite deliberately, the most escape-proof address on earth, and to St. Helena, through long weeks of grey rolling ocean, they carried the man who had crowned himself in Notre Dame. He was given a house on a high, bare, windy plateau in the middle of the island, a place called Longwood, a damp and droughty former farm that the sea fog wrapped for much of the year, its walls sweating, its wallpaper, it was later whispered, a poisonous green, its rooms low and cheerless, its garden battered by the trade winds. Here the last years passed, slowly, and then more slowly, in a shrinking round of very small things. There was a household of the few faithful companions who had chosen to follow him even here, and they kept up, among themselves, the little rituals of a vanished court, the forms of address, the etiquette, the pretense that the emptied throne still meant something in a farmhouse at the bottom of the world, and there is something both absurd and unbearably moving in that. A handful of exiles bowing to one another in a leaking house on a rock, keeping a fire lit that the whole earth had agreed to let go out. And there was the governor. The British had set over the island a careful, anxious, rule-bound official named Hudson Lowe, a man whose entire purpose was to make certain that this prisoner did not, under any circumstances, get away a third time, and who pursued that purpose with a thoroughness that curdled, over the years, into a long, small, grinding war of paperwork and pinpricks between the two of them. There were quarrels over what the prisoner should be called, over how many candles he might have, over whether he could ride beyond a certain line without an English officer at his elbow, over the cost of his household and the reading of his letters. The conqueror of Europe, who had moved 500,000 men across a continent, now spent his mornings in bitter disputes about the grocery bills and the boundary of his walks, and there is a bleak comedy in it that he himself must have tasted. The man who had dictated laws to kings reduced to arguing with a bookkeeper about firewood. The days themselves had a slow, closed, unvarying shape, the shape that days take when a life has nowhere left to go. There was the late and reluctant rising, the long bath in which he lingered for hours as the mist pressed at the windows, the dictation, the meals taken with the little household in the forms of a court that no longer existed, the reading, the games in the evening, the early dark. There were books sent from Europe, and newspapers months out of date that he read all the same, hunting through them for his own name and the shape of the world that had gone on without him. There were the horses he was allowed, and the narrow bounds within which he might ride them, and after a while he rode less, because to ride was to meet at every turn an English sentry and the edge of his cage, and he preferred the garden, where the walls were of his own building. He gardened. This is one of the small, true, human things that survive from those last years, that the restless soul who had never been able to sit still, who had exhausted relays of secretaries and worn out horses and marshals, took, at the end, to digging. He set his little household to making gardens on the bare plateau, moving earth, building low walls against the wind, planting and watering, quarrelling with the governor about the water too, and in the turning of the soil found something that came as close to peace as anything did on that rock. And he talked, Above all, through the long damp days he talked, and a few devoted men wrote down what he said, hour after hour, month after month, his memories, his campaigns, his version of everything, the reasons and the justifications and the legend, all of it dictated in that flat, rapid voice to companions who filled page after page. He was fighting, in those years, the last and shrewdest campaign of his life, and he knew it. He could not win back France with soldiers, so he set out to win the future with words to shape, from his rock, the story that the world would tell about him after he was gone, to make himself in memory not a tyrant who had drowned Europe in blood, but a son of the Revolution, a bringer of law and reason and opportunity, a giant undone by the small and jealous kings. It was, in its way, his most successful campaign of all, for the legend he dictated at Longwood outlived every fortress he ever took, and much of what the world still feels about him was written by his own hand in exile, with the fog against the glass. It is one more of the quiet ironies gathered around his end that the man who had never in his life been able to hold still, who had crossed and recrossed a continent as though distance were nothing, should have found his last and most durable weapon in a chair by a smoking fire, in stillness, in words that the general who lost his final battle should have won the argument about it, and gone on winning it for 200 years, from a farmhouse he was never allowed to leave. He would have appreciated that, I think. He had always understood better than his enemies that a story well told outlasts a fortress well built. But the body was failing while the legend grew. He had never been strong on that damp plateau, and year by year he grew heavier, greyer, slower, often unwell, keeping more and more to his rooms, riding less, then not at all. The illness that was quietly killing him was the same one that had killed his father long before. In the hard first days of the family's story, a cancer of the stomach, patient and merciless, that no doctor of that age could touch. There were the last months of pain and weakness, the shrinking appetite, the long hours in a darkened room, the faithful few keeping watch, the governor's suspicions and the doctor's helpless remedies. And on the 5th of May, in the year 1821, in the afternoon, with a great storm blowing in off the Atlantic and tearing at the trees he had planted, the restless heart at last grew still, and Napoleon Bonaparte died at Longwood House on the island of St. Helena, aged 51, far from Paris, far from the sun he had not seen in years, far from the rocky island in another warmer sea where the whole story had begun. They buried him there, at first under a plain slab without a name upon it, in a quiet green valley on the island he was never allowed to leave, beneath the willows near a spring whose water he had liked, and the fog closed over the grave. And the ships went on calling for their water and sailing away, and for a while it seemed the world would simply forget the rock and the man upon it. It did not forget. Nearly 20 years later, when the passions had cooled and the fear had faded into something more like wonder, France asked for him back, and a ship was sent all that long way to the South Atlantic, and the plain grave was opened, and the body carried home at last across the sea to Paris, up the great river of that city on a grey winter day, through streets packed with silent crowds and old soldiers weeping in the cold, to be laid to rest beneath a golden dome in the heart of the capital he had made the centre of the world. The exile come home, the wanderer stopped. The long, long journey from a foggy harbour to a rock in the ocean folded up and put away at last under the marble and the light. And the crowds that lined the streets that winter day were not, most of them, the men who had marched with him. They were their sons and their grandsons, people who had never seen his face, who knew him only as a story their fathers told by the fire. And yet they wept, and bared their heads, and stood a long time in the cold to watch a coffin pass, which is perhaps the surest sign that a man has stopped being a man and become something else. A legend, a weather, a thing the whole people owns together. And there we may leave the man himself, and lift our eyes, slowly, and let the story widen out into what remains. For this is the strange thing about him, the thing that keeps the lamp burning over his name 2 centuries on, that the empire he built with such effort, the thrones and the marshals and the great glittering court, all of it blew away like the smoke of his own guns, gone within a single lifetime. The map redrawn and redrawn again by other hands until scarcely a border he set survives. The crown is gone. The conquests are gone. The eagles are in museums. And yet, when you walk into a courtroom in France, or in Belgium, or in the Netherlands, or Italy, or Spain, or in Louisiana far across the ocean, or in 100 countries that took their law from those, the book they reason from is in its bones the book he made, the Civil Code. The Code Napoleon, the clear plain gathering of the law into one place where any citizen might read it, which he always said, and rightly, would outlast all his victories, and which has. The idea that a man should rise by what he can do and not by the name he was born with, careers open to talent, the ladder let down for the clever poor boy from nowhere, is so ordinary to us now that we forget it had to be fought for. And he, the poor clever boy from nowhere who climbed that ladder to the very top, drove it into the foundations of the modern world. The tidy machinery of the state that governs so much of daily life, the schools, the roads, the numbered houses and the measured weights and the orderly files, carry his fingerprints still. The map of Europe shivered and rearranged itself around his campaigns, and never quite settled back. And the legend he dictated against the fog at Longwood grew and grew until it became a kind of weather of its own, retold in 10,000 books and paintings and films, argued over endlessly. The very measure by which the world still weighs ambition and genius and ruin, so that to call a man a Napoleon, for good or ill, is understood in every language on earth. He is the proof, written across the whole face of a continent, that a single human being, given the right chaos and enough will, can bend history for a while to the shape of his own restless mind, and the proof, just as surely, written on a rock in the sea, of how that same will, unable ever to stop, unable ever to be satisfied, will carry a man past every triumph and out the far side into ruin. History does not disappear. That is the quiet truth under all of it. The battles end and the empires fall and the emperors die on their islands, and none of it vanishes. It only sinks down and settles and becomes the ground we stand on without noticing the laws we obey, the borders we cross, the words we use, the very shape of the possible. He is under our feet now, that Corsican boy, folded into the foundations, quiet at last. And so let us bring them back one final time, gently, the two of them, and let them rest. The slight, unknown young officer standing among the cold guns in the December fog at the harbour, a nobody with an odd accent, his whole enormous life still ahead of him, unimagined, unbegun, about to fire the shot that starts everything. And the tired old man in the damp house at the bottom of the world, gardening in the wind, dictating his memories to the sea, the whole enormous life now behind him, gathered up and finished, ready to become legend. The boy in the fog and the exile by the water, the same soul at the two far ends of the same long day, and between them everything, the crown and the code and the snows and the sea. Let them lie side by side now, the beginning and the end, and let them rest, and let it all grow quiet. Are you still awake? It is all right if you are not. The story is told, and the lamp has burned very low now, and there is nothing left to do but rest. If some part of you is still listening, there is another video waiting for you here on the screen, another long, quiet life to sink into whenever you would like it, ready when you are. And if you have enjoyed this slow walk through a life, and only if you truly have, you might quietly follow along, or leave a small mark of having been here, so that the lamp stays lit for the next traveller who cannot sleep. But that can wait. All of it can wait until morning. For now there is nothing you need to do, and nowhere you need to be. Let the day slip the rest of the way from your shoulders. Let the harbour empty of its smoke, and the island grow quiet, and the great long story settle into the dark like a stone into still water. Close your eyes. let the lamp grow dim and dimmer, and go out. Good night, and sweet dreams.